Hello and welcome. My name is Fran and I'm the host of the Off the Lead podcast. Last night I spoke to Anthony Murphy of Mythical Ireland. Anthony is a fascinating character, evident in every moment of this recording. I'll make sure to share all the relevant links to his social media platforms, where I would encourage you all to be guided down a Mythical Ireland-shaped rabbit hole. And as always, if you're enjoying the kind of conversations that I'm having on the Off the Lead podcast, remember, if you're only listening, you're missing the entire point. So get talking, sharing, liking and subscribing. For in order for evil to thrive, good men and women need do nothing. So without any further preamble, I give you my conversation with Anthony Murphy of Mythical Ireland. And we're live. Anthony, before we came out to the tunnel to start recording, I basically asked you, when did this all start in Ireland? Were there pre or proto-humans? Were there Neanderthals? And you mentioned the Ice Age. And I said, listen, we won't get into it. We'll wait till we get out to the tunnel and start talking about it. What did the Ice Age got to do with anything?
Well, the Ice Age is a very significant event in Irish history because around 10,000 BC, so around 12,000 years ago, the Irish landscape was very dramatically altered by the ice, but not just the landscape, the humanscape, because, the archaeologists and the anthropologists tell us that there was no human life in Ireland at the end of the Ice Age. So you had very significant sheets of ice, which are carving out the landscape, and then all the meltwater washing everything away. So I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but I don't know what happened to everybody. Presumably a lot of people died with the cold, etc. Some people may have fled the country and gone abroad somewhere. All we know is that pretty much there was no human life in Ireland from about 10,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago. So if you go back, the first evidence of life in Ireland, human life in Ireland, is from Mount Sandel, which is near Coleraine on the north coast, and that's around 8,000 years ago. Sorry, 8,000 BC, I think. And before that, nothing. And we're told that those first Mesolithic, that's Middle Stone Age, so this is pre the arrival of farming and the builders of Newgrange, we're told that they would have come from Europe, or actually the most likely first influx after the Ice Age might have come from Wales or the Isle of Man or Scotland.
And that's purely based on proximity, basically.
Yeah. So in effect what I'm saying is we're all British in origin.
Of course. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that'll wind up
a head-blowing fact for us to start with,
Of course. But just on the timeline, 10,000 years ago is fucking no time at all. At all.
It's a very short time span. A lot of people have this idea of the Irish as a very ancient race. I think we've been, obviously, because we're an island nation, we've been separated from the mainland of Europe for a long time, of course. And we are different, and we're very unique in our sort of culture and in our outlook. Yes, all that is true, but we're not genetically unique, I don't think. And of course, lots of studies have been done about that. But we're very young as a people, you can trace life on the African continent, for instance, back 100, 200,000 years at the very far further back than that probably. But in Ireland, you see, anything that existed in Paleolithic times, in the Old Stone Age, pre-Ice Age, was carved away by the ice or washed away by the meltwaters. So the problem is, you'll often have heard, absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence.
Yes.
And so the fact of the matter is that there is a paucity of remains from pre-Ice Age times. Very little evidence. One piece of evidence is a 300,000-year-old piece of flint that was found by Professor Frank Mitchell, who's the late Professor Frank Mitchell, who was he was many things, an anthropologist and a geologist. He lived at Townley Hall outside Drogheda. He found a flake at a quarry in Drogheda at Mel, which he reckoned had been worked by human hands about 300,000 years ago. It's in the National Museum.
300,000?
Yeah, 300,000. So, there was undoubtedly human existence here a long time ago. But the fact is that the Irish people, as we currently exist, were first seeded, as it were. The birth of the Irish people began only about 8,000 BC, so about 10,000 years ago.
Okay, so whoever was knocking around on the island of Ireland were long gone. And on them being long gone, like, what kind of timeline are we talking about for the Ice Age? Like, was it 1,000 years? Or?
Yeah, I'm not really too au fait with that. And so I should probably say at the outset, I'm not an academic, so I'm not formally trained in any of this stuff. I just happen to be really interested in it, and I've spent 20 years of my life researching it. Not entirely sure. I think several thousand years.
Can you be an academic or an expert in what you kind of specialize in, because there's so many disciplines? I mean, there's mythology, there's cosmology, there's anthropology, geology, and God knows there's probably half a dozen different ologies in there. So
yeah, a lot of ologies. Yeah,
to be an expert,
Yeah, well, there's a good point there, and one of the things about Irish archaeology specifically is that Irish archaeologists don't learn anything about astronomy. And I think those who are dealing with prehistoric culture in Ireland should have a knowledge of astronomy, because a lot of the sites are, let's say, cosmologically aligned or inspired, So Newgrange would obviously be the best example of that. In some countries of the world, archaeologists do have a good working knowledge of astronomy.
As part of the curriculum, or just
as part of their training?
Yes.
Yeah, because it's important in terms of the overall interpretation of sites. And the other thing then is mythology, which is the jury is very much out on in Irish academia. So you have some archaeologists who are very cognizant of the mythology, actually some who have written about descriptions in mythology that may or may not tie in with the archaeological evidence, and that's a very interesting area of research, but an awful lot of archaeologists kind of avoid it. So for instance, the very eminent and talented and very famous Professor George Ogan, who excavated Knowth for the best part of 40 years, a wonderful man, a very nice man actually. I know him, and actually used to go to Knowth while he was there, and got on very well with him. But he has produced 6 volumes of books about the excavations of Knowth, the latest of which is about the Passage Tomb archaeology, and it's a 900-page tome. It's massive. This thing is like a doorstep. It's huge. A very, very impressive collection of technical data and descriptions of various aspects of the archaeology. Everything from the source of the stones and the makeup of the stones to, the dating of the bones and all of this stuff. But I have to say, I'm disappointed. Not a single mention of the mythology of Knowth and where Knowth got its name from, which is spoken about in the medieval manuscripts, the Dinshenicus, the old stories that tell us about the eminent places. And I thought that a little disappointing, even though the work is tremendous. It's basically a lifetime's work. And parts of it are tremendously technical as well, so it's not the sort of thing you would sit down with at night intending to read from cover to cover before you go to sleep. Just put it that way. But for instance, Michael O'Kelly, who excavated Newgrange, the very first thing he speaks about in his book about Newgrange, which I think was written in the early 1980s, was the mythology of Newgrange and the stories of Newgrange, the oldest traditions of it. And I like the fact that he opened with that, because it's very easy to discard myth as having no meaning, but in actual fact, my life's work has really swung towards mythology as being probably a crucial element of the interpretation of these sites,
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it was even from myself, who was to say I have a rudimentary understanding of mythology is an understatement. But even I get the idea that the pyramids were built to, worship gods or whatever it was, and Newgrange the same to a greater or lesser degree. But certainly theology and mythology and everything else was the real driving force behind building these things in the first place. So to study them without having an underlying understanding of that would seem, missing something, if to say the least.
Yeah, well, the way I look at it is So the archaeologists, now don't get me wrong, I'm not here to spend the interview bashing archaeology.
Oh no, not at all. Absolutely.
And in fact, archaeology has been probably the single most important discipline in teaching us what society and what life might have been like in the Neolithic. However, it doesn't provide a full scope or a full answer to all of the issues. And so, for instance, archaeologists have a term for this type of monument. They call it a passage tomb. Now, a passage tomb is a very functional description, and even archaeologists will admit that it falls short of describing all of the functions of the likes of Newgrange and Nowth and Dowth, which are the most famous examples of that type of monument. In fact, they're the biggest. There's nothing bigger than them. There's nothing grander than them. But in the myths, these are called she, S-I-F-A-D-H-E, or in Old Irish, sheed, S-I-F-A-D. So there's a word for these places that doesn't translate easily into English. It's been translated as fairy mound or, burial mound or whatever. But I think the word she is far has far more gravity. And I think when you strip a place of what it would have been known as, I think probably to the builders. So there's this difficulty with the language, because according to the experts, Irish doesn't go that far back. We didn't speak Irish when we were building Newgrange.
And what do they think we did speak?
We spoke what they called Proto-Indo-European, which is like this,
a step up from grunts.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not an expert in linguistics. All I know is that I am told that the words don't go back, but you see some of the myths, I think, go back, which is why it's important. So around the 12th century, the Cistercians arrived, and they had a very big influence in what happened here in conjunction with the Normans. So the Cistercians set up Mellifont Abbey.
And sorry to cut across, but who or what were the Cistercians, or where did they come from? Or just
I think they're originally a French order.
Okay.
And they set up Mellifont, I think, on the instructions of Saint Malachy.
So they were Christians?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. These are Christian monks, you
yes.
know. And they became very influential. So they took all the land, all the way down to the Boyne, and they set up what were called granges or farms, to feed themselves and to keep their community sustained.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, there are several place names in existence right now, townland names, that are actually Cistercian in origin. So I'll give you some examples.
Yeah,
Newgrange is one. Sheep Grange, Rough Grange, Little Grange. These are all place names in the vicinity of the Bend of the Boyne that are Cistercian. So when people go to Newgrange and they see the magnificence and the splendour of it, I don't think they appreciate the fact that the name Newgrange is actually a 12th century. It's only 800 years old.
Yeah, of course.
The original name of Newgrange, according to the manuscripts, was Sheed in Broga, or Sheon Vrue, as we might call it now. And it was also known as Sheed Macanog or Brug Macanog. And Macanog was Angus Og, who was the son of the chief god, who was said to have been born there in a miraculous conception, as it were, an immaculate conception of sorts. Anyway, I know I've digressed a little bit. I apologise if the viewers or the listener has been dragged left, right and centre.
Every episode has been the exact same. We go off on tangents and down rabbit holes.
I think the main point was that I don't think it is prudent to not ignore, but to not factor the mythology into your interpretation of a site.
Yeah, of course. No, absolutely. Yeah.
While at the same time, yes, absolutely, as I said earlier, archaeology has probably been the key discipline in terms of teaching us about things that we just simply didn't know about before there were excavations. So it's very valuable on the one hand, but it's not, let's say the archaeologist doesn't have a premium on the interpretation of the sites. And if you read an archaeological tome about any prehistoric site in Ireland, you've got to accept that this isn't the final word.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Do you think that we need a new discipline, nearly? Like a new ology, Do you know that kind of way?
Yeah, a combinology. Yeah, an all sortsology. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, but then, having not been academically trained in any of this, I don't know what it's like to go through university and study anthropology or mythology or cosmology or whatever. All I know is that I think the whole reason Anthony Murphy and Mythical Ireland exists is precisely because there was a gap in the knowledge that hasn't been recognised or filled in by academia. You know, that there's a whole mythical and cosmological aspect to the prehistoric monuments that is not fully recognised, basically.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it came up in my last in the last episode with Ivor. We were mentioning, I think it was Göbekli Tepe, and even the pyramids and different places, which all would have been, maybe not so much now, but certainly originally, excavated and studied by foreigners, say, you know, Germans and English and Europeans mostly, I think, who didn't know the local mythology or didn't know the nuances of what it's like to live in a scorching hot desert, or, you know, closer to the equator, or to have a rainy season, and little things like that. And without that kind of local knowledge, which you obviously have, because sorry, are you born and bred in the Boyne Valley?
Yeah, I was born in Drogheda. I've lived there all my life. Yeah.
So you have that almost insider knowledge.
Yeah, but then a lot of my knowledge is as a result of the fact that I'm a bookworm, you know.
Yeah,
more so than a genuine tradition, you know.
Yes.
Like, we don't have to go that far back until to a time when the oral tradition carried a lot of information from one generation to the next. So the folklore, for instance, the stories that were carried down from generation to generation, and that started dying out in the 20th century, which is why the Folklore Commission was set up, because it was recognised that the folk tradition was dying, and they needed to record as much of it as possible. That was a fabulous effort by a fledgling state that had no money, cash strapped. So you had the likes of Seamus Ennis, the famous piper from the Knoll in Dublin, who cycled out into Connemara on his bicycle to collect stories and music from people there who, when they passed, were going to bring a whole load of tradition with them. I think he interviewed one gentleman in a place called, is it Glanske? I can never remember what its exact word. Something to do with it's like Glenishke. Anyway, this particular gentleman was a musician. He played the whistle, the penny whistle, you know. And he recorded 127 songs from this man that were sort of local to that area.
Yeah, and would have been lost otherwise.
And that this man could play without ever reading or without having written any of this down as musical notation.
Yes.
And Ennis was there to do that, you know, to actually write it down, to try and save it, as it were.
Yeah, immortalise it.
Yeah, knowing that these people were all going to die and that they weren't passing it on anymore, you know. So that whole aspect of our culture has died away. So I suppose it's a little bit of a disclaimer on my part that I don't come from a genuine tradition. My tradition is more academic, as in what I expound in my books and what I talk about in my videos and on my website. It's all stuff that I've learned. I haven't been taught most of it. You know, there isn't like an Aboriginal myth or storyteller in the Boyne Valley.
I know what you mean. Yeah,
you know, because
you're not a 10th generation storyteller.
No. I know. I have to say, I don't apologise for that, because just because you haven't picked it up directly from an ancestor source, as it were, doesn't mean it's not genuine.
Of course.
And the problem is a lot of this stuff has sort of languished in books and on vellum and manuscripts in museums and collections all around the place. And it is a little bit inaccessible, you know.
No, absolutely.
Like, there's a fair amount of popularised translations of works in that. So if you really wanted to study it, you could get into it in a big way, you know, as I have done. And I'm still literally 20 years down the line, I feel as if I've only scratched the surface, quite genuinely.
No, I'd well believe
it. Huge body of mythology and folklore in this country. Huge. enormous, almost unquantifiable.
Yeah.
And I think bigger than the classical world and bigger than any other collection of myths and folklore from around the world.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating to me that there are people like you that's reading the academic journals and dusting the cobwebs off books that none of the rest of us are ever really going to look at, realistically, not en masse at least, and putting it into books. So your books are presumably for a wide audience. They're not for academics. They're for the general public, say.
No. You don't need to be a specialist to read them, of course. It might help. Like, so in the case of my first book, Island of the Setting Sun.
I love that name, by the way. That's class.
Well, that's from mythology.
Really?
I mean, that's from the arrival of the Milesians, who came to take Ireland from the Tuatha Dé Danann, who were the gods who were said to have built Newgrange North and Douth. And the Milesians came from Spain to take Ireland from the Tuatha Dé Danann. And their spiritual figurehead was a man called Amergin. And according to tradition, he landed on the estuary of the Boyne and planted his foot on the shore as the first of the Milesian arrivals to officially sort of declare it, I suppose, for the Milesians. And he said, "What land?" He said, "Who but I knows the place where the sun sets? Who but I knows the ages of the moon? What land is better than this island of the setting sun?" And of course, it didn't take me long to realise that, this is like the Japan of the West.
Yes, absolutely.
In the Orient you have the land of the rising sun.
Yes.
And here on the far side of the continent, because the continent of Eurasia stretches all the way from, say, Portugal and Spain, all the way west to
China,
Vladivostok and the western city or the eastern cities of China, and then next stop Japan. And in the case of the western side of Europe, next stop, Britain and Ireland. So I think that's, it's got a mythical aspect to it. The point was, I think we were talking about, whether people needed to be an expert. Not really, but definitely with the first book, it would help if you had a knowledge of astronomy.
Okay.
Definitely, I found the feedback is from people who know something about astronomy, it's easier to get through. If you know nothing about astronomy, it's a little bit more difficult. And
when you say know something about astronomy, I mean, I'm afraid to say I do. Do you know, kind of given the company, but look,
I know.
I get that.
I'm not talking about advanced stuff now.
Yeah, so I mean, put it this way: I would have maybe a slightly above rudimentary understanding. I understand that the moon goes around the Earth and the rest of the planets go around the sun. The sun goes around a black hole, presumably at the centre of our galaxy, the Milky Way. It's barreling through space along with a couple of 100 billion other...
Well, the ancients didn't know a lot of that.
Of course.
But the more rudimentary stuff.
But what more am I missing then? Because on the moon in particular, I wouldn't be great.
The moon is probably the biggest one, actually.
Yeah, and that's the one that I think that most people are least...
Like, the moon goes around the Earth once every 27 point something days, and it goes from, say, if you see a full moon tonight, the next time you see a full moon is 29 and a half days. So... there's two separate periods. One is the period it takes the moon to go from the background stars, so say the constellation Aries, round the zodiac back to Aries takes 27 and a half days.
Okay.
But if the full moon is in Aries tonight, while the moon will return to Aries in 27.5 days, it won't be full for another 2 days after that. So each full moon arrives in a different constellation. And trying to tie in the lunar year with the solar year is a significant aspect of ancient astronomy, not just in Ireland, but actually in all cultures around the world. And every culture did it. And that knowledge, in fact, was still existent among unread people who couldn't read and write, Irish peasants in the 18th century. People knew about the complicated movements of the moon and the 19-year metonic cycle and the eclipse intervals and the epact, which is how Easter is calculated. You know about Easter is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. Yeah, well, it's tied to an astronomical date.
Yes.
And of course, that a lot of people think that Easter was a prehistoric festival anyway, long before Christianity, which shouldn't come as any great surprise because Christmas, after all, is very strongly tied in with the winter solstice and the birth of the new sun.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So that's probably the one that's missing. And the reason I think it's missing, well, the sort of astronomy we get taught today doesn't teach you that, because you don't need to know it now, because you have a clock and you have all sorts of ways of telling you what time it is. The natural way, you don't need to know it anymore. Of course.
Presumably the people at the time, let's say Newgrange and the early people, they would have had to have been particularly in tune with the moon for the tides, for the comings and going out of the Boyne Estuary and that. So it would have had much more of a...
Well, there you go. There's Amergin, who's the leader of the Milesian expedition, which sailed, so a Spanish armada of the prehistoric world, according to the annals, about 1700 BC. So Bronze Age, if you believe that it's a historical record of an invasion, which I don't think it is.
Okay.
It's a mythical invasion, but there are, of course, parallels in what really happened in Ireland. We are, as I said earlier, a maritime nation because we're an island.
Of course.
Until Dublin Airport was built, the only way in and out of Ireland was on a boat.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, when you put it like that, yeah, absolutely.
So we have an extraordinary maritime history and prehistory, even down to the people who built the great monuments, who fetched the curbstones, the giant curbstones for Newgrange and Nowth, some of them weighing 5 tons. There's a mean weight of about 3 tons, which is the weight of an Asian elephant. And they all had to be brought strapped to the underside of barges down the coast from Clogherhead and up the Boyne to the bend of the Boyne.
No mean feat.
No,
and then
absolutely.
out of the boat and across
97 of them at Newgrange, and then another probably 100 large structural stones. Well, actually, I think the total, it's in my other book, Newgrange Monument to Immortality. I think there's about 400 large structural stones at Newgrange alone. And that's basically 400 journeys up and down the coast and up and down the river.
And is there, or have you, say, an estimate for the type of, like, the volume or the body of people that was involved? Like, what kind of figures are we talking? Even ballpark?
It's very difficult. And there's a lot of reasons it's difficult. And of course, the archaeologists rightly hedge their bets on this. The first thing is very important to say, is that we don't have any evidence of large-scale community at Newgrange in terms of habitation. So, in plain English, what does that mean? It means that we haven't found where they lived. They didn't live in the mounds, because the mounds were clearly for a very sacred, cosmological, spiritual, mortuary function.
It's the equivalent of churches to a degree these days.
Something similar, yeah.
Yeah.
So we haven't found large scale, like for instance at Nowth there was evidence of a pre-passage mound house, an early Neolithic house, which might have dated to about 6,000 years ago, to about 4,000 BC. But we don't have any. We haven't found, did they live in a village, or where did the community who built this actually live? So it becomes very difficult to figure out what size was the community. So you're down to all sorts of variables in an equation. How many people could whatever food was available in the Boyne Valley support, for instance, is a question. But even that's a variable, because they had introduced farming. So what was the scale of the farming? How many fields or paddocks of grain were they growing? How many cattle did they keep? And down to then, because we know they fetched stone from Clogherhead, and we're pretty sure they brought some of the stones from Dundalk Bay, and it is speculated that the quartz at Newgrange came either from the Wicklow Mountains or from Rockabill Island. Now Rockabill isn't too far away, but it's still, maybe 20 miles. A river and sea journey. Wicklow, that's an 80-kilometre journey. You have to get the stones down to a boat first of all, and then you got to get the boat up the coast. So it's very difficult to estimate the size of the community that was involved. And there's an emphasis recently in the archaeological research on a regional community and a regional effort. So you're not talking about 100 or 200 people based in the bend of the Boyne. You may be talking about a lot more people, who were
based
involved
all over
in the
Leinster nearly.
Yeah, basically. And then in that scenario, a community could have built it in a shorter time scale. What we do know is that there's evidence at Newgrange where the cairn material, so the water roll stones, which is what makes up most of the cairn, they're brought, and then there's a period of inactivity, and then you can see a layer of growth where basically, while they weren't building, there was a bit of grass growing and all that. Yeah,
right.
And then more stones. So there's a few layers where the work had stopped. The other thing is that the archaeologists tell us, and it makes sense, that the mounds were built at quiet times in the agricultural calendar. So there's times of the year when you're busy, you're harvesting, etc., etc. I presume our Neolithic ancestors had to be involved in calving and looking after the young cattle, Now, nowadays, most cattle herds are either calving in the spring or in the autumn.
Or indoors whenever you want, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
These days.
And of course, some farmers have mixed herds, spring and autumn calving. So there's going to be times in the calendar when you've got more spare time and you've got surplus food because you've had your harvest, etc., etc. And so the supposition is that there was a lot of building activity when the agriculture was quiet. But how long is a piece of string in terms of how many people were involved and how long it took? It hasn't been quantified, and I think there's a very good reason for that, because we only have very limited material evidence, and as I said, probably the single most important factor is that we don't know where the community lived.
Yeah, on where they lived, and again, I don't even know where I'm getting this, but my understanding of kind of ancient Ireland was that it was pretty much forest from coast to coast, with the exception of maybe Connemara, where it was too rocky. So presumably early settlers here came up our estuaries and, felled enough trees to obviously light fires and build huts or houses or whatever they were living in, and cleared a certain amount of land to farm.
Yeah.
So does that line up with what you would have thought?
Yeah, that's fairly accurate. Apparently, now if you take the experts at their word, obviously in the immediate aftermath of the Ice Age there wasn't much in the way of forestry, but apparently in the Mesolithic, around the time the first people arrived, Ireland was very heavily forested. I've seen it suggested that a squirrel could make its way from Mallinhead in the north to Mizenhead, which I think is the most southerly point of Ireland, without its feet ever touching the ground. Right. I don't know whether that's true or not.
Well,
that's a very impressive statistic, if it's true. It's the sort of thing you could, if you had a few drinks and you're at a party, you could impress your mates with, oh, come here, wait till I tell you, because they think, Anthony the geek, the studies Stone Age stuff when everyone else is watching Game of Thrones or whatever, There are some very impressive statistics and numbers that you can throw out at people. That's one of them. You're very right, by the way, about the deforesting. In order for the monuments to have been built, there has to have been deforesting. And curiously, there's two references in mythology, in the Genealogy. There's two references to the clearing of trees. Sláine, from whom Slane gets its name, King Sláine, he was a Fir-Bolg king according to the myths. He's supposed to be buried up on Slane. By him, the wood of the brew was cleared, or something along those lines. It's in one of my books. And the other one is to do with the plain of Brega, which is a sort of, I was going to say ancient, it's not that ancient. Brega would have been very important, especially in Norman times, when Naut would have been the capital of the Norman kingdom of Brega. But it would cover sort of a lot of what is Meath today. Yeah. And there's a reference there about a guy felling trees. I think it's Brogan, son of Brega, is it? Can't remember exactly. That's in my new book, Mythical Ireland. So there's two references in myth to guys apparently having forests cleared for the construction of monuments.
But it's not the thing about mythology. It's not just stuff that our ancestors just made up. They're stories that explain their history. It was a way of, I suppose, communicating the past to future generations. Or was it?
Well, mythology, I think, has many functions, and that's maybe one of them, that some of the myths contain aspects of major events that might have happened, and sort of maybe climatological disasters and that sort of stuff around the world. There are creation myths, of course, which every culture has creation myths, origin myths about where we all came from.
Of course, yeah.
And there are many similarities there, which is fascinating. Myth has many functions I think there's an allegorical side to mythology. It's like life training in a way, It's like mythology is full of lessons and
how to act.
Yeah, and then metaphors, So a great deal of work has been done by the likes of I think it all started probably with C.G. Jung, who was a famous psychotherapist, a Swiss psychologist.
Carl Jung.
Yeah, same guy, yeah. And there's a lot of devotees to his work. I'm one of them. I find his work fascinating, although he's very heavy academically, and you need a dictionary to read any of his books. Any of his books that are translated, the words and the terminology, you actually need a dictionary. He's very heavy going in that respect. So then you have the likes of Joseph Campbell, who was very much a Jungian, what you would call a protege or a student. And Campbell, I think, successfully translates the concepts and the language of Jung into easy to understand layman's terms. And so Campbell will tell you a lot of myth is down to some very, very basic principles of life, like the hero's journey, which is what we're all on in life, is, finding your path in life and finding your true self. And that a lot of myths are allegories and metaphors for that journey, which I think is fascinating. There's a lot of cosmology in mythology, and I'm not just talking about astronomy and the stars. Cosmology, as in the idea of the cosmos as being everything is one and one is everything. Like the smallest atom is part of the cosmos.
Yes.
And of course the atom is apparently indestructible. So long after you and I are deceased physically, the billions of small particles that make us up will survive, which I think is fascinating.
Is it Carl Sagan I'm quoting here? I'm always butchering quotes and misquoting people, but I think it was
so
Sagan.
am I, except for when I write them in my books and I have to get them right.
Was it Carl Sagan that said that we are stardust?
Yes.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. He was fabulous. I love his book Cosmos.
Yes.
Which is wonderful and very well. Sagan was like Campbell to me. Sagan was a guy who could translate the complicated language of cosmology and astronomy into everyday language for the ordinary human being who wanted to know a little bit more. But what the hell are you talking about? And he made it fascinating. It's really fascinating. And I think Campbell did the same thing with mythology. Now we're getting into heavy ground. Well, not heavy ground, but you're kind of getting away a little bit from the archaeological sphere. And maybe that's where you lose the archaeologists. They hear guys like me talking about this stuff and they think, well, what the hell relevance does that have to my field of research? And what they don't realise is that mythology can offer very keen insights into ancient cultures. It's just you have to let go of your preconceptions about mythology. We cannot for definite say a particular myth. A lot of the myths are described as medieval because they're written down in medieval times. But of course, they predate medieval because they were passed down. They were passed down by word of mouth, the oral tradition, which is very powerful in Ireland, as it was in other parts of the world. So how does a myth... can I give you an example of that? How do we know a myth might be prehistoric? So at Newgrange, before the excavations, so I'll just for the sake of your viewers who mightn't be familiar with the story of Newgrange, Newgrange was excavated at first in the 1960s. Properly excavated. There were small little bits of excavation done before that, but significant work that was done at Newgrange to investigate it and to repair and restore it and to make it safe were carried out by Professor Michael O'Kelly starting in 1962 and running on until probably the early 1980s, but certainly into the 70s. So before O'Kelly touched Newgrange, the result of 4,000 years of subsidence, 5,000 years of subsidence had meant that the passage stones had leaned in and the roofing stones had sunk because of the huge weight of material on the cairn. It's all stone, so about 250,000 tons of stone sitting on that cairn, weighing down on it. At some stage, not too long after it was built, within 500 years, they reckon, the cairn material slipped out over the curbstones and covered all the curbstones. So you no longer had this delineating ring of giant curbstones around it, and also buried the entrance. And the archaeologists say it was buried for 4,000 years. Before O'Kelly's excavations began in 1962, there were people in the Boyne Valley who were able to tell him the sun shines in there at a particular time of the year, and it lights up a tri-spiral in the chamber. They were able to tell him that Newgrange was once covered in white quartz.
All kind of later proven, say, after it was dug out.
Exactly. And stuff about the gods and this, that and the other. But yes, all stuff that was borne out by the the repair and reconstruction and excavations. So one of the things that O'Kelly did that was very important was he restored what we call the roof box, which is this aperture, this opening above the doorway. And that was the one that allowed the sun in, that shines into the central chamber. So before O'Kelly's restoration, you couldn't see the sun shining into the chamber at Newgrange. That hadn't been witnessed for about 4,000 years.
Yeah.
And yet the locals were saying, well, this is what happens, you know.
But that's the beauty of having a local man to talk to.
That's the idea.
What was Kelly's name, sorry?
Michael O'Kelly.
O'Kelly,
well,
sorry.
he was attached to University College Cork. So I suppose in some regards he probably would have been considered a bit of an outsider.
But he was,
the way it works, everything's very parochial in Ireland, or at least it used to be, you know.
But at least he had the foresight to speak to the local people. Like,
yeah.
You could easily see how he wouldn't have entertained what they had to say or not spoken to them in the first place.
Yeah. And he carried out probably what was the most important act in bringing us Newgrange today as it once was. And there was no evidence of white quartz at Newgrange before it was excavated. Why? Because the quartz was originally on the front of the monument and around the side, sort of, O'Kelly says, as a vertical wall, an almost vertical wall.
Like a facade, say.
Yeah. And when the Keown collapse happened, whenever that happened, early Bronze Age maybe, that was the first thing to give way, and that was the first that was buried under all the Keown slips. So that's right at the bottom.
Yeah.
Of everything. So when you come to Newgrange before the excavations, you see a grass-covered
hill, essentially.
Hillock with trees growing out of it, cattle grazing on it. And even though there were stones exposed, and so when Charles Campbell acquired the land in the area in 1699 after the Battle of the Boyne, he was a Protestant settler. He ordered his servants to get stone from Newgrange to build his farmhouse and his buildings. And very shortly after they started robbing stone from Newgrange, it's just a stroke of luck actually, they started to take stone exactly where the entrance was. So shortly after they started this job for Campbell, they discovered the entrance to Newgrange, and that was when the first of the antiquarians came, Edward Lloyd, who came along and said, hang on a second lads, there's something very important going on here, and was the first to describe and draw the interior of Newgrange. Probably Campbell's labourers were probably the first humans to see the inside of that monument, certainly for centuries, if not for several millennia.
Yeah.
And yet, here you had the locals saying, you know, it was once covered in white quartz.
Right.
Now, there's a chapter in my new book that I would maybe draw your listeners' attention to, which is about this, this pre-excavation folklore. The chapter is called "The Archaeologist Who Unwisely Dismissed Newgrange Folklore," and this is an archaeologist who basically poo-pooed the whole thing. I'll read it to you, because it's a very interesting quote. A coloured calendar current in Ireland in 1960 had in it a good photograph of the decorated stone at the entrance to Newgrange. This was accompanied by an account which needs quoting almost in toto as an example of the jumble of nonsense and wishful thinking indulged in by those who prefer the pleasures of the irrational and the joys of unreason to the hard thinking that archaeology demands. The entrance in the east was originally triangular, says this description, but is now changed for easy entrance. Formerly, it was necessary to crawl in, and progress was retarded by interference, stones compelling the neophyte to stoop and stumble. The rays of the rising sun at certain times of the year penetrate the opening and rest on a remarkable triple spiral carving in the central chamber. Like the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, the Newgrange Temple was originally covered with a layer of white quartz and was a brilliant object of light for a considerable distance. Nudda, the first king of Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, and his master magician are said to have officiated here in the very, very old days. And so, of course, the archaeologist poo-poos the whole thing, says all nonsense, and then O'Kelly goes and excavates it and finds out that actually some of it's not only true, but it's quite remarkable. Yes, the sun shines in there, and it doesn't shine directly onto the triple spiral, but its light does light it up. And then the other thing, which I think is very significant, is, well, what do you know? At the bottom of this cairn slip material, there's a layer of white quartz, which couldn't have been seen before that. But if you believe the archaeologists, on the one hand, they're telling you this collapse happened 4,000 years ago, and on the other hand, they're saying, well, poo-poo the folklore, sure, it's a lot of nonsense.
Yeah, yeah.
But the folklore says there's white quartz there, and the archaeology proves it.
But
it's quite extraordinary, really.
It is, no, it is. It's fascinating, and I think that's the problem with academia generally. Like, you know, in secondary school you learn a bit about everything. Then in you know, you go off to college and you learn a bit more about everything in a bit more detail, and then it just it gets narrower.
You get tunnel
and
vision, don't you?
You do, and that's great, because sometimes you need a guy to go to carbon 14 date this thing or whatever the hell it is, and that's fantastic. But that's why I said kind of at the outset of this, do we need a mixology of all these different things?
A holistic discipline, one that takes an awful lot of other disciplines into account.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And I think we're entering into a golden age of what you might call kind of citizen scientists, or something like that. Like, you're a bit of a citizen scientist to a degree.
Yeah, well, I hope so. I hope we're not retarding, which seems to be what's happening in certain parts of the world, where there's a movement against expert knowledge, you know.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And the conspiracy brigade, who want to believe that the earth is flat and that the monuments were built by aliens.
Yeah, what do you think all that is? Is that a pushback or what is it?
Yeah.
Is that a pushback against elitism?
Yeah, I think it's probably a refusal of certain people to, in the Jungian, there's that Jung again, Carl Jung.
Yeah,
in the Jungian outlook, it's probably a refusal of certain individuals to basically confront themselves and what's in them and their own shadow. And the pushback in a lot of cases is against their own deficiencies, rather than, you know, it's a form of jealousy, I think, in a way. Anti-intellectualism, you know?
Yeah.
People who want to believe that airplane pilots are spraying us with chemicals, and who say that the earth is flat, and who vehemently defend that position. And when you tell them, but sure, there's millions of pictures of the earth from space, oh yeah, they're all faked by NASA to go along with this conspiracy, and the moon landings were faked, and blah blah blah. Actually, the only conspiracy that I really believe is that there was more than one person involved in killing JFK. Because the evidence actually points towards it. Yeah, and sure, all you have to do is look at the footage in the immediate aftermath as to where all the people in Dealey Plaza ran to. They ran to the grassy knoll because that's where they heard the shots coming from.
Yeah, well, I think the worst thing about conspiracy theorists generally is that they take attention away from the real conspiracies, because people do conspire, and there are conspiracies that really need our attention and our knowledge, but they get lumped into, you know, the moon landings were fake and the earth is flat and all the rest of it. So it kind of draws your attention away from genuine conspiracies.
What's sad about the whole situation is that the likes of, say for instance on TV, you have the likes of people who are popularising science and that, you know, science-based research. So you have the likes of, I'll just throw out a couple of examples. So Carl Sagan, that we spoke about, was fabulous for that. David Attenborough has been a fantastic proponent of the Earth's natural world and the ecosystems that support it. Brian Cox, you know, and before him Patrick Moore in my day, who was it was one of
the Sky at Night. Was that Patrick Moore?
Such an old-fashioned sort of geeky gentleman.
But, monocle and all.
Oh, loved him. He was my idol, you know. Yes, well, if you look up into the sky at night, you will see a very bright star in the south. That is serious, you know. I just loved him. I mean, he was old-fashioned and, you know, like the English gentleman and all that. But he was a gentleman. In fact, I never communicated with him, which I regret. But any of my friends who did got letters back from him, typed.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah, personal. Like he spent a lot of time communicating with people, you know. But anyway, my point was, despite the presence of all these people, extolling, you know, science and proper research, you have these brigades of people for whom all of their research is done online on websites that support their view, and who don't have the maturity or, you know, the intelligence, I think, in some cases, to accept that there might be an alternative viewpoint to theirs. And There's a lot of sort of ram it down your throat sort of stuff going on online. It's very disheartening, actually, because for all the advances we've made, there's a significant proportion of these people. That's the thing, I think. There's a significant portion of people, probably not so many in Ireland, but I think sadly growing all the time, who, don't want to get into reasonable debate about things, and who are not interested in the facts, and will say anything to support their own viewpoints, and I do think it's dangerous. The problem is that, like when you're dealing with people who allege all sorts of sort of major conspiracies involving hundreds of thousands of people, which, for instance, the moon landings,
or 9/11 was the other classic example, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, how do you deal with that? How do you rationalise with these people? The answer is you don't rationalise with them. What needs to happen? I don't know, but I think that's part of the effect of not having a mythically rooted community and culture. So just to expand on that, just in case your listeners are going, what the hell is he talking about? What I mean is that you don't have to go too far back in Irish history. So let's just take Ireland as an example. A couple of generations ago, people were still telling stories. Communities were, broadly speaking, close-knit. People look after each other. And that stems, I think, from ancient times, where communities were small, where everybody had to look after everybody else. There were the usual priests or holy men and women and shamans looking after the community. And one of the ways that the community was nourished was through its myths. So myth provides a very, very important grounding function. And one of the things, as I said earlier, is that myth is a psychological thing. It's a psychological tool, as it were, whereby you're taught the lessons in life through the allegory of myth and the mythical symbol and the mythical vision. I believe, and I agree wholeheartedly with those who would say that in Western culture we've lost our myth and we've lost our mythical voice. I think that's part of the reason that we have this dichotomy, this huge variance between the learned people whose knowledge should be sacred and then the unlearned who insist that they're entitled to their own voice and their own opinion, etc., etc. The problem is that associated with that, there's a move towards nativism and xenophobia.
Yeah, tribalism, nationalism, all the rest of it.
So I've had to be very careful myself with that, because I realised that certainly in some of my earlier work, if you read it, you might get the feeling that I was quite patriotic. You might, yes, I believe there's something unique about Irish culture, of course. Yes, I love Ireland. Yes, I want to preserve that. But at the same time, you have to kind of live for the times that you're in.
Of course, yeah.
The point is that, one of the points is that the fact that society and culture has changed, and technology has improved, and the way we live our lives has improved, does not mean that mythology should suddenly be irrelevant and defunct. And I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody out there, but I think that part of the difficulty for Ireland right now, and I can only speak for Ireland, is that we so we've given up on our spiritual life because we tie it in with organised religion.
Yes.
Which is one of the fundamental problems.
Yes, absolutely.
Of the modern world, is that people have heaved against religion. They've moved against it. They've rebelled against it for very good reason, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Along with the scandals, the fact that the mythical image of the church, the images that religion provides us with, have lost their relevance.
The way I would phrase that is, and this might be a bit harsh or unforgiving, but I see organised religions as having bastardised our mythological stories. Are innately human stories that, like you said it earlier on yourself, that continents separated by oceans have the same or relatively speaking, the same mythologies. We were all thinking the same things. We all had the same hero myths, the same flood myths, the same kind of virgin mothers and such. And the fact that we all came up with these kind of independently, to me at least, shows the innate trueness of them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that organised religions, all of them, have played their part in destroying them to a certain degree, in keeping it theirs was the right one and other people's one was the wrong one. And I would have been a strident atheist all my life and would still be a devout atheist, but over the last number of years I've gotten very much into the beginnings of the stories, the essence of the stories, and I think they're critical to a functioning society. I think that's a Jungian approach, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and actually probably more so Joseph Campbell. I think Jung's sort of pioneering work was the fact that he realised that what he was saying and writing was going to appear to be mystical.
Yes.
And he was speaking to a scientific and academic community.
Yes.
And they were going to say, this guy thinks he's a priest, you know. And he knew that. And so one of the things that he did was he looked into world mythologies, to find the facts to match his intuition, which I think was something that he said himself. I need to find the facts to prove my intuitions, you know. So he was a guy that followed hunches, but definitely needed to find the evidence. And he found in mythologies, those common streams that you speak of, these things that are in far-flung, disparate nations, you find the same images coming up in mythology and the same storylines.
Yeah.
Why is that? Of course, the likes of, there's a guy called Witzel who has produced a huge tome on world mythology that I've read quite a bit of, and it's very interesting. Maintains that was a migratory pattern, that you can trace the myths around the world as the migrations occurred, whereas Jung said no, that they stemmed from this thing that he called the collective unconscious.
Yes.
And I think in essence what that is it's you know, he uses the word psychic and people's psychic lives quite a lot, which makes them sound mystical, but I think it's the idea that these are things that go right down into the depths of us as humans, these images that spring up from each of us, which appear to be individual but in fact are collective, you know. And I think in terms of the world myths, you have this sort of modern movement away from mythology, and to get back to the reason we went down this avenue was to do with religion. I think part of the reason that religion has become unpopular in certain cultures, because remember, there's still a lot of religious people in the world, and quite devout, and we shouldn't take that away from them. We shouldn't denigrate them for it, although at the same time, a great part of what went wrong with the church is because the church became a political body.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, of course.
So the church became such a huge movement. So say, for instance, the Catholic Church, which is the faith I was raised in, and by the way, I would definitely describe myself as agnostic.
Right.
And the very best description of that is that I don't have enough evidence to prove that a God exists and an afterlife, but I certainly don't have enough evidence to disprove it.
Of course.
So I kind of sit on the fence and hedge my bets.
It's the reasonable man's answer to a degree, is it?
I think it is, yeah. And I think in some ways atheism in Ireland has become a hard response, like a hard Brexit. You know, a hard Chexit, if you call it an exit from the church. You know, a hard Chexit, where people have said priests were paedophiles and they abused children. Therefore, all religion is bad, and I don't believe in God anymore. And I think that is a very, very serious overreaction to, and I'm not saying that's necessarily the case in your own situation, or I don't want to generalise. I just think it has been a hard exit, as it were, from spirituality, which is different to the church. And one of the big problems with the how do I say that word? Demythologization of society. I just invented a word. I must contact the Oxford Dictionary when this is finished. One of the problems is that religion insists that the metaphor is not a metaphor.
Yes,
it's
literal.
It's literal. And the central warrior, as it were, spiritual warrior, the central icon of our faith was Jesus.
Yes.
And how did Jesus talk to his friends? In bloody parables.
Yeah.
Symbolic language. In other words, I'm going to tell you a parable, and that parable is designed to help you sort of lead a good life kind of thing, to provide you with an example. Did the story that he gives in the parable actually happen? No, it didn't. He's just given it as an example. So what does the church do? Everything that the Bible says is literal. And so they tried to force on us the idea that the earth was only 6,000 years old, and there was a guy called Adam and there was a woman called Eve who was magically created from Adam's rib.
Yeah, the word in 6 days, he rested on the seventh and all that jazz, yeah.
So if we kind of fast forward or move across to the Irish mythical sphere, do I believe that the myths are stories of real happenings? I think they are in some cases.
Yes.
But you have to look upon the myths. Well, each one has to be treated differently, of course, because each one is different. But, you know, some of the myths are allegorical, some of them are cosmological, some of them are spiritual, some of them are downright meaningless, you know. Some of them are probably just stories that are made up for entertainment. But you can't fit all of them into any one box. And you certainly can't say that myth is recorded history, end of story. And that has been one of the major problems with organised religion, is here is the metaphor and the myth that we've given you. This is our mythology, because that's what, ultimately, you have to be careful, I don't want to offend anybody, but to me the mythology is, the Bible is largely mythology. But to some people it's so sacrosanct that it's, to them it's to describe it as mythology is a form of heresy, you know.
It's a denigration of their beliefs, and it's a belittling of their ideals and all the rest of it. And look, I'm not here to offend anybody else either.
No,
you know.
But what's the halfway house if there is one, you know? Because on the one hand, you had a very devout Catholic population here for a long time. And look, let's call a spade a spade. Some of that was undoubtedly tied up with the political situation.
Yes, of course.
You know? And of course, the Catholics and the Church were persecuted in Ireland. So, you know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger kind of thing, you know? And so, yeah, you only have to look at the churches in Drogheda that were built in the 1880s, like St. Peter's Church in Drogheda, and you stand beneath it and you look up and you go, wow, this was built before the mechanical digger and before health and safety and before all of the modern techniques.
And the rest of it.
And look at those stones and the way they're all cut, and look how the whole thing is formed. It's fabulous, you know. So I think religious zeal is very important, but religious zeal, don't forget, also drives nations to insanity. So people are going to say, Anthony, you're contradicting yourself, because earlier on you said that part of the difficulty that Ireland is in is we've lost our mythology. Yeah, but I want to make sure that people understand the difference between religion and spirituality. So religion is very much an institution made up largely of men telling you this is what you should think and this is how you should behave in order to attain some sort of existence in the afterlife.
Or else.
Which there's a threat there, isn't there?
Of course, yeah.
The blazing fires and all the rest.
Yeah.
Spirituality is very much the Campbell-esque idea, Joseph Campbell, where Campbell said, you know, too many people, when they reach the edge of a forest, they see a pathway through the forest and they want to follow the pathway because it's instinctive and it's natural. You just want to go. If you're going to go through the forest, you might as well walk on the path that's
course
there.
Of least resistance.
Yeah. And he says that's the very worst thing you can do with your life. You need to beat your own path through life. Because if you're following someone else's path, then that's not your path. And to me, that sums up the idea of a spiritual life. A spiritual life doesn't mean that you have to chant mantras and dress up as a druid or whatever it is that makes you tick or tickles your fancy in terms of your own religious and spiritual practices. The difference is that in a spiritual life, you actually become an individual, which feeds back a little bit into the Jungian idea of individuation, which is not what people think it is. It's not necessarily that you become a holy person, or that you become an ascetic and a hermit and detach yourself from your community, or that you become some sort of the theologians, the hierarchy in the Catholic Church, for instance, who are able to back up everything they say because it's all written down in books and in the Bible and this, that and the other. So they're very academic, and they're able to back up their arguments with fancy words and fancy quotations. I'm talking about somebody who just doesn't want to go with the flow, but at the same time doesn't just adopt a position out of opposition. A position of opposition.
Yeah.
A supposition, an apposition. Let's think of as many Ishan words as we can. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. No, the point being that in my own spiritual life, I had a wake-up call which came with 9/11.
Okay.
And that challenged my faith. Initially, drew me in desperation to try and cling on to whatever little faith I had and to try and make that come true for me and to give me some nourishment through times of crisis. So I would have suffered from depression and quite a bit of anxiety. But I found it didn't give me any nourishment whatsoever.
Your faith?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I don't mean to ask you a too personal question, but you were religious, say, or...
Not massively so, to be honest.
Okay, but
no.
you believe, did you go to Mass, say, or like, did you believe...
No, when I became an adult, really, I stopped going to Mass.
Right.
I just, at that time, kind of said, well, this is the only thing I kind of have grown up with. So I need it to help me.
Yes.
But I felt like, and I described this to friends and relatives in the intervening period, I felt like I was entering a cave and shouting for help. And that all I was hearing back was the echo of my own voice.
Right.
I got nothing from it.
Yeah.
Nothing. No nourishment whatsoever. And around that time was when I was really starting to read about Irish mythology. So this whole journey has been fascinating for me because it's been a personal spiritual voyage for me, which I don't think you ever reach the end of your spiritual growth, by the way.
Yeah,
you
may agree.
Maybe there are certain holy men and women in the world who do attain a nirvana, as it were, a point of apex in their spiritual life where they feel that they're so close to God or whatever it is, divine life, that they can't ascend any further and then they die. Fair enough. But I don't think you'll ever sort of, as a human, I don't think your spiritual growth ever ends. But what does that mean to the ordinary guy on the street who's listening and saying, what is he talking about? I'm talking about the Matrix. Red pill, blue pill. I'm talking about getting out of the system. The system. Now, this sounds like a conspiracy theorist, going back to earlier on about chemtrails. I'm not talking about a conspiracy. I'm just talking about finding your own path through the forest. You know, what is it? What are the things as a human being that make you feel fully alive? In my case, there's many things. I mean, photography and writing and being out at the sacred sites and the monuments, being out in the landscape, playing music, all that sort of stuff. You know, the things that I do for enjoyment.
Yeah.
And how does that enter a spiritual realm? But the most spiritual experiences are sometimes very profound, but sometimes they're very banal. You know,
they're always personal, though.
Personal, exactly, because like one man's Damascene conversion is another man's road to hell, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, what was my conversion? Well, my conversion was a sort of a deconversion, actually. And this is something I do dip into in my new book, Mythical Ireland. You know, there's a personal aspect to it. I kind of lay bare my soul a little bit in an effort to just expel this stuff from me, you know, get it off your chest sort of stuff, you know?
Yeah.
Like when you've been... in the traditional cultures of the world, in the likes of Africa and in other places, probably in Ireland too, you always have a shaman. And a shaman, according to Campbell, is not necessarily somebody who just has become a sort of a holy man or a holy person out of right or birthright or, you know, out of some particular distinction because he has a particular aptitude for learning. A shaman, in many cases, is a guy. Now, look, I'm talking... I have to be honest. There's there's definitely a sort of a male bias, isn't there? When we think of shaman, we think of men, don't we?
Oh, of course, absolutely. Yeah. Well, men,
we have to acknowledge the possibility that in prehistoric culture, women had a significant sort of spiritual role. And the other thing is, but if you read the mythology in Ireland, there are very important male deities and there are very important female deities. So there's a pantheon. It's not monotheistic, which is another problem, by the way, with religion. But if you go back to, let's go back to Campbell and the shaman. The shaman, according to Campbell, is somebody who's had a significant breakdown, a significant cracking up, as he calls it, where they've lost their mind, where they've reached a spiritual crossroads, where they've had a crisis that's shaken them to their core as a human, and where they've basically gone off into the wilderness or gone up to the top of the mountain, become an ascetic and removed themselves from their community, which is an important aspect of it, and encountered themselves and their own darkness in the forest, and looking into the mirror, and the water is a very, very significant dream symbol in the Jungian works. Water is a very significant symbol for the unconscious. And why is that? Because water acts like a mirror, and the mirror faithfully reflects back what looks at it, as it were. And the problem is, in modern societies, a lot of people are purely driven by ego and don't realise that this is a mask that they wear and is only one aspect of who they are, and it's a sort of an almost practiced, rehearsed, forced personality.
Their persona.
So the shaman is the one who goes off and takes off the mask and confronts his own darkness in the wilderness, and sometimes that can take a long time. But the key thing is that the shaman comes back to the community restored and strengthened by his or her experience.
Yes.
And is then in a position to help heal members of the community because they've been through this terrifically difficult journey, this dark night of the soul. Now, I'm not saying I'm a shaman, so don't get me wrong. I'm not going to be egotistical about it. All I'm saying is that I had my own long night of the soul and my own journey into the wilderness. And I think that now, 20 years, well, it's not 20 years, it's 17 years anyway. Now I'm a much, much stronger person spiritually for it than I was at the beginning. Because see, at the beginning, I only had what I'd been told.
Yes, you hadn't discovered anything yourself, say.
Yeah. And when through a journey of self-experience, and your own experiences in life can teach you some hard lessons. That's what life is, and that's what I believe a lot of the myths are about. They're metaphors for these hard lessons that you encounter in life. But at least, even if you're only mythically aware of them, you're not getting a literal lesson in how to prepare yourself. At least you're prepared somewhat for what's to come. Because life ain't easy,
Isn't it the only guarantee is suffering, say?
Death and taxes, some people say, yeah. Suffering, yeah. I suppose it depends on your outlook too. I mean, I used to be a very pessimistic person, and I think I'm a lot more optimistic now. That doesn't mean I don't worry about the future of the planet, which I think could end in chaos at any moment, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Let's call a spade a spade. With all the shenanigans that are going on in the world at the moment, all it takes is one lunatic to press a button. And it's game over for all of us.
That's been the same way since the Cold War, really.
Yeah. Because one major event today in terms of an attack or a war could spiral, could affect. I mean, we have a global economy now, so, something major happening in one part of the world could affect everybody.
Yeah, but was it... Where the fuck was it? Was it Hawaii? Had the scare? They sent out a
missile incoming. This is not a drill.
This is not a drill.
Yeah, no. I mean, what would you be doing?
Jesus Christ!
How many people spent their life's savings in those few moments?
Yeah, and who told who they loved them and whatever else?
Yeah,
do you know that kind of way?
Yeah.
Oh no, that was a mistake. Oh shit.
Yeah. The other thing too is that modern society is very ill prepared to deal with death and dying.
Oh, very much so. Jesus.
And growing old.
Yes, absolutely.
And you only have to look at the appalling way we treat our elderly in Ireland.
Yes.
Now, look, I'm not here to be negative.
No.
I'm actually I did say there, I'm a very positive person. So, I don't like to generalise, but in some cases we treat our elderly very appallingly. And we're very ill prepared for death. There's a very interesting new book brought out last year called My Father's Wake by a man called Keown. Very interesting read. And in it, he supposes that, and I think he's right, that the Irish wake is the last remaining vestige of a very ancient rite of the community that has been a very important part of human life and getting through life and dealing with death since the earliest days.
And the wake being that you stay with the body.
Yeah, that you have contact with the deceased.
Yes.
And he calls the opposite to that, the antithesis of that, is the Western death machine, which is, oh no, as soon as they die, take them away and bring them to an undertaker, and the undertaker does all the dealings, all the nasty stuff that we once did as communities. And then they're made up and presented in suits, in boxes and all the rest. And in Britain, he says that a lot of people, except for close family, a lot of people don't actually get to see dead bodies anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas in Ireland, we definitely have a tradition of not just seeing them, but touching them and kissing them and all the rest, you know? Now, in the Neolithic, at the time of Newgrange, I don't think a lot of people who are alive today could deal with the way the dead were handled in the Neolithic. Because, a lot of the burials in the passage mounds were very fragmented. Some of them are cremated and some non-cremated.
The remains that have survived today?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
They were processed. So, there's a little chapter in my new book about it. They were dismembered.
Okay.
Cut up.
Yeah.
Burnt. And then fragmented somehow further.
Okay.
Before all of the little bits and pieces were carried into. Like today, we go to a thing called a crematorium. And again, the curtain closes.
And it's game over.
On the coffin.
Yeah.
And that's the last we see. And then a furnace blasts the thing until there's nothing left but kind of a fine powder, bits and pieces, And
you get a little porcelain urn and you bring that home and whatever else.
But in the Neolithic, somebody had to be responsible for the processing of the body.
Yeah,
now,
everyone did to a degree. Do you know what I mean?
I think it's likely that there was a much greater involvement, community involvement in it,
There would have had to have been, yeah.
Like if you look at the tradition here, and the wake is kind of dying in fairness, there is a huge community involvement, isn't there? And somebody has to wake the body through the night. That's going on still in Ireland,
yes,
I'm glad
absolutely.
to say.
Yeah.
Where, people do a shift through the night, 2 hours here, 2 hours, where you need to be in the press. And that's unheard of in a lot of Western countries today. It's no, the idea of being in contact with the dead body is appalling to some people, Anyway, in the Neolithic, somebody had to cut the body up into pieces and then burn it and all the rest. So we have very, very different ways of looking at things, To them, I assume that would have been a very natural thing. And in fact, Marion Dowd from Sligo IT, who has done some work on ancient bones in Ireland, so I think it was Marion Dowd, I could be mistaken now, but I think she suggested that they might even have worn pendants with a bone from their deceased relative.
Okay.
That like a relic.
That's kind of cool, actually.
The religious relics, Like
an actual part of your dad, your granny, or whoever it was.
But that idea is disgusting to a lot of people now.
Yeah, I can see how that would be.
Carry a bone around with you,
Yeah,
it's revolting.
Sacrosanct.
Yeah, but so we just kind of have moved on so much. I think life has become very clinical in some regards. If you look at the system, and again, this is matrix stuff, but not conspiratorial. I mean, it's just the nature of the system that we've made is such that it is a system. It's robotic in nature. It's like a machine.
Yeah.
And we have become like machines.
Yeah, traffic lights.
And when we become like machines, what happens?
We act like machines.
We lose our mythical voice.
Yeah.
We're no longer spiritual and mythical beings. We're robots. And what happens then is that people crack up. And the system can't deal with that. The system just wants to drug people who crack up. It doesn't want to effectively deal with them.
Yeah, give it a term. He is, a mental illness, call it what you will, and here's the pill for said mental illness.
And then you see there's such a huge stigma around the area of mental illness in Ireland.
Yeah, massively
Well,
so.
that's
Still.
because historically we haven't been able to deal with it. Because historically, if there was something wrong with you, you were punished for it.
Yeah.
Now, that stemmed undoubtedly to some extent from the religious orders.
Yeah, that's our kind of our recent history, say.
You know. But I think it's very difficult for people to latch on to the idea that re-engaging with our mythology can somehow help them. And this is where you have to be careful. Some of the people who follow Mythical Ireland are, New Age types and are a little bit away with the fairies in more ways than one. I don't want to denigrate anybody because everybody's different, And I've encountered some really, really lovely people. But when you get talking to them, there's some very, very strange ideas, So people who looking from the outside appear to be very normal and very healthy people and very friendly and very nice people. But then you find out they have very peculiar views on things. Like they might be mad conspiracy theorists, or they might think that aliens built Newgrange. There's absolutely no evidence for that.
Yeah, yeah.
I have to be careful in my work not to... I try as much as possible to back up what I say with some sort of evidence. But undoubtedly some of what I've written might come across as being a little bit new agey. And I think there's a resistance to that in modern society. And it's the same resistance that religion has encountered. It's the same sort of resistance. People are saying, well, we don't believe that Jesus died. Why would God punish his son like that? Like, in fairness, that's a good argument.
Yeah, of course.
What father that you know of, which of your friends would willingly sacrifice their child's life?
I couldn't begin to imagine it.
And see them tortured.
Yeah.
Even though apparently it's for some greater good.
But these are the type of questions that I asked as an 11-year-old, and I got insufficient answers and just went, this is bullshit, and just lost faith with it, for want of a better term.
The problem is, and the real problem is, that nobody stopped and said, hang on, this is just a metaphor, and this is the meaning of the metaphor.
Yes, it's all about sacrifice and whatever else.
Mm-hmm. It was used as an image that had real vitality. In other words, you were taught that this actually happened, and that if you don't believe it, well, there are serious consequences. So there's always a threat. And I believe that threat-based religion is a big part of what's wrong with society now. Because we couldn't deal with all this threat. We have enough of a threat hanging over us. It's called death.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're all going to die.
That existential angst. Yeah.
And this is something I talk about in my book, Newgrange Monument to Immortality. And one of the reasons I called it that was because I believe that the Neolithic people believed that life was immortal, that after you left the body you still had vitality, your soul went somewhere. And this is evidenced by near-death experiences, or at least that's if you accept the near-death experience as evidence of a crossing over. But certainly a lot of people who have had positive near-death experiences, it's been a very sort of life-affirming and life-changing event for them, But you've been taught that, no, this is actual history. This man died so that yours, and all that, and all that, and all that. And transubstantiation, the turning of the bread and wine into...
bread, yeah.
I mean, come on, folks. If we only just realise that it's okay to speak metaphorically and allegorically and to speak in symbol. Symbols resonate with human beings. We are naturally drawn to symbolism. We make symbols and patterns out of things where they're not there. It's called pareidolia or pareidolia. Pareidolia, I think it's called. You might see a bunny rabbit in the clouds. Or you might see something in the bark of a tree that looks like the face of a man, and then a religious guy will say it's Jesus, and another guy will say it's
Buddha or
Hare
whatever
Krishna,
it is.
Yes. And never the twain shall meet. What about the person who just goes into the forest and says, I just want a moment of calm? I find that, so I might be describing myself here. I might be along the River Boyne somewhere, I might be in a forest, I might be on the top of a hill somewhere, I'm watching a sunset, or I'm watching the water and listening to the sounds of the water. I may be watching a buzzard flying, I might be watching swans swimming along. And in those little moments of my life, I have encountered eternity, where you just want to freeze that.
Yeah.
That moment is all eternity for you. It's like, you've suddenly realised that you're at an apex in your life. In your spiritual life, you just feel, wow, yeah, I'm having quite a profound little moment here. I'm out in nature. I'm away from the system. I'm not on the rat run. I'm not in traffic. I'm not running to an appointment. I'm not trying to prepare a report for my boss. I'm not trying to pretend to be somebody I'm not. I'm just out here in my own skin, on my own terms, in nature. And you know what? It feels bloody good. And how about that being a spiritual life for somebody?
No, absolutely. That resonates.
How is that not more profound than believing that a human being was sacrificed by some god 2,000 years ago so that all our sins may be forgiven and all the rest, and that we might attain eternal life? Why not, try and encounter some sort of a spiritual existence on your own terms, without the framework of a church or a body of people that says thou shalt and thou shalt not, which is very much the language of religion. You will and you won't. And if you don't, this is the punishment. And if you do, this is the reward. Well, feck that. How about I have my spirituality on my terms, which I think is what I've decided. But the one thing I didn't do was to consider atheism, because for me personally, number one, it wasn't an intellectual response. And number two, it wasn't in tune with my own sort of instinct. I couldn't declare everything spiritual to be dead because of certain happenings. See, humans are humans at the end of the day. And you'll see all sorts of stuff about the Word of God and all the rest. But the Word of God was written down by men.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So what's the difference between the guy that says he's writing for God and the guy who's a New Ager, for instance, and who's channeling information from beings from another planet and says that they've got all this advice for us and all these warnings for us? So which one should we take more seriously?
Well, I would be sceptical of anybody who told me that they had any answers, never mind all the answers. Do you know the kind of way that I think the little of your work that I've dipped into, because I consciously didn't really go deep into looking at, reading your books and watching all the videos, because I wanted to speak to you here from the viewpoint of somebody listening, not from the viewpoint of somebody who was already very familiar with, you say.
Yeah.
But that idea, that what you mentioned there about kind of finding peace with yourself, and you could phrase it as almost being one with God, say, in that moment. I think people are yearning for that. People are really missing that, and I think there is a move away from that systemic, robotic society that we live in now. And the whole fundamental underlying principle to what I'm doing here is a pushback against that. What I call the domestication of our species, of you and me and everybody listening. We needed to be domesticated to a certain degree so that we can live in large scale societies. We need to be civil to each other. It can't just be I'm bigger and stronger than you, so I'm taking your land. We had to be civilized. So a certain amount of domestication was necessary, I think. I think we've gone too far down that road, just over the centuries and millennia maybe. But there's certainly a pushback, and there's certainly a move towards spirituality and a move away from religion. And the two most popular podcasts that I've had have been with the same guy, Ivor McQuillan, and all we talk about is spirituality and the idea of death and rebirth and finding your own path through life. Ivor's used psychedelics in a big way to navigate his way through life, and would be an advocate of experimenting with substances that alter your consciousness to get a better understanding of yourself. And there's a real resurgence in this type of conversation that we're having.
Yeah, which I suppose is healthy in itself. I think once people are willing to engage in the conversation, it's always a good start. I think one of the difficulties is that rampant atheism that's there is, I think now, and I could be mistaken, and I'm no theologian, but I think it's a kind of an overreaction to the scandals and the difficulties that people have with the church and the perceived cruelty of the religious bodies in various scandals that have happened. But what relevance, I suppose, does that have to the myths of Ireland? is probably one of the things your listeners are have probably reached a point in the conversation and said, well, you've said this and you've said that, and now you're saying that a spiritual experience just can be just the simplest things, like standing by the side of a river or watching a sunset. The point is that so long as your mythology, or your belief, as it were, doesn't insist that you have supremacy over somebody else, as you said, we have to kind of live with each other. We have very limited resources. The population is growing. The planet is shrinking in many respects.
Yeah, we're getting closer.
You know,
we're being forced to be closer.
Yeah. The point is that so long as your mythical or your religious beliefs don't encourage you to act violently against either your fellow human beings or your planet, I think that the poet or the musician or the artist always seems to have the language or the symbolism to communicate the angst of the society in which they're living at that moment in time. Look, here's just one kind of spurious example. I found that the songs of U2 when I was growing up, I don't like their later work, by the way, I found that they captured a certain angst, and they captured some essence of what it was to be growing up in Ireland. So the troubles were going on in the north, and we had economic catastrophe in the 1980s, and we lost an awful lot of our young talented people who emigrated. And we hadn't really confronted the religious situation was about to burst open. It was about to become a tidal wave washing over the country, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But maybe in the 80s it hadn't just quite happened, because it was only later that we learned about a lot of all of the scandals and that we sort of started to confront them. And that's a very painful process that's still going on. I just found that that's just an example. The music of U2 seemed to capture it. And then I think about stuff that I've written about. So, for instance, my new book, I talk about the poets by the Boyne, and two in particular, who are Francis Ledwidge and John Boyle O'Reilly, who both were very talented poets and were very mythical characters in many regards. Ledwidge loved walking along the Boyne. Boyle O'Reilly wrote about his longing to come back to the Boyne and wanted to be buried at Douth, And so if we think about the time frame, Boyle O'Reilly, 19th century, and, because of his involvement in, let's say, nationalistic and Republican activities, was sent away to Australia to hard labour, and then escaped from there and went on to America, where he became a very passionate Irish-American voice, and a very powerful figure in many respects. And then Ledwidge, who was a very, very talented poet and who uses the most extraordinary, beautiful language, and who then signed up for the British Army and went and fought in the Great War, and wrote about his longing to come back to the Boyne and the simple stuff, which was just to walk along the Boyne at Cruban and Rossnaree and all the rest. And he never got his wish. He wrote very prophetically. He wrote a poem called The Dead Kings. All the dead kings came to me at Rossnaree, where I was dreaming. I have a chapter about that poem in my book, because there's a mythical sort of significance to it. If I could just find it here, I'll tell you very specifically. I want to read the last couple of lines of it. Page 220. Available in all good bookshops, by the way.
Use the code word off the lead for a 75% discount.
Yeah, you'd be doing well. Retail price is $29.99. And one said, since the poets perished, and all they cherished in the way, their thoughts unsung, like petal showers, inflame the hours of blue and grey. And one said, a loud tramp of men we'll hear again at Rossnaree. A bomb burst near me where I lay. I woke, 'twas day in Picardy. And what actually happened to Ledwidge was a bomb burst beside him and he was blown to bits, and that's how he was killed. So that poem is very prophetic in many respects. And I just find that in every age there's a poet or an artist or a writer who's able to capture the essence of the struggles of that age. And it's almost always framed heroically or mythically, isn't it? You know, I mean, if you look back, if you look at any of the great sort of artists of the last couple of centuries in Ireland, there's a great sort of mythical or heroic aspect to their work. So the likes of Yeats and his friend George William Russell, whose work is very mystical, extraordinary. Russell claimed to have visions of the She and the other world, the many-coloured land, as he called it, which he reckoned coexisted with our world, you know. Which in essence is the whole idea of the She as the original description of the monuments, a portal or an access point, a place where you venture between realms.
Like a portal to the afterlife, say?
Well, the afterlife, or another realm of consciousness, or another spiritual plane, or whatever.
Call it what you will, yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I just find that in every age there's the artists and the musicians and the poets are the ones who are able to give voice, as it were, to the struggle that's going on. I think that we overcame the worst of our bestial nature, as it were, with the conflict. You know, the conflict in Northern Ireland, which, when I was a kid, dominated the daily headlines.
Yeah,
atrocities almost every day, and all of the murders and all the tortures and all the stuff that happened. And we now find ourselves, having moved on beyond all that and all the religious scandals, we actually now find ourselves in a very sort of place, a very spiritually bereft place.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
We're in a vacuum now.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah,
big time.
Okay, economically we seem to have done well. Of course, we crashed the economy. And by the way, the politicians didn't do that. And neither did the lawmakers, and neither did the banks. The ordinary people of Ireland are largely responsible for that. Yeah, there's a very controversial remark.
There's a very controversial remark. There's a 4-hour podcast in
itself.
Yeah,
well, let's not open that can of worms.
We'll get you back for that one.
But, you know, there has to have been a public to have been complicit in all this. So they were the people who were buying houses, or trading up, actually, in a lot of cases, to totally unsustainable mortgages. How did they think they were going to last? You know, all that.
They were sold a dream, but again, you know,
anyway,
we won't.
No,
not today.
So apparently now we seem to be doing, but that's only a facade, of course, because a lot of people aren't doing well economically,
of course,
and a lot of people are living on the breadline and on the line of poverty.
Yep, soup kitchens are on the rise.
Even considering all that, and outside of all that, our spiritual health as a nation, what's it like? Let's define it here for a second. Let's make that the subject of conversation.
Off the top of my head, I would have said it's non-existent.
Yeah. So in essence, we're almost like an atheistic secular culture, right? And people say, well, what's wrong with that? You know, this is modern life, and we don't believe in these, you know, men in white thrones with white beards decreeing this, that, and the other against humans. I'm not talking about that kind of spiritual life. I'm talking about, you know, if you're grown into the system and you're moulded to the system, then, and there was a beautiful quote by Campbell about Star Wars, because, you know, Joseph Campbell was involved in Star Wars, because a lot of the storylines of Star Wars are based on world myths. And
yes.
Campbell and George Lucas were good friends, and Campbell advised Lucas, and there's an Irish myth in there. The losing of the Nuadu, who was, by the way, I mentioned Nuda as he was mentioned in that 1960 calendar. Now, he wasn't the one that officiated Newgrange, it was Dagda and Elkmar. Anyway, nevertheless, they weren't too far off, because Nuadu was one of the supreme Irish deities of the Tuatha De Danann, and in the first battle of Moitura, he had his arm cut off. And when the king had a blemish, he couldn't rule anymore, that was the law. And in his absence, a king called Bres ruled, and he was partly Fomorian. And if ever you wanted a parallel for what's going on in the United States of America right now, and I'm not mention any names. I'm not opening that bloody can of worms to tell you. Read the story from Irish myth called The Reign of Bres, and I will say no more. And then what happens is that Nuadu, having been deposed because he's armless,
yes,
has a new arm fashioned by the magician, healer, Dian Kecht, who makes him a silver arm. And my friends, if you've ever seen the scene in Star Wars where Luke Skywalker confronts Darth Vader and has his arm chopped off, at the end of that movie you will see that he is fitted with a new silver robotic arm, and that myth is inspired by the myth of Nuadu, of the silver arm from Irish mythology.
Savage.
Yeah, it's mad.
That is class.
But what was my point? My point was Star Wars. Yeah, Campbell had a lovely way of speaking about Star Wars, is that Darth Vader typifies... and I'm paraphrasing here, and I may be embellishing. So
go for it.
Let's say this is a Campbell Murphy quote, right? We, in being bred into this machine that we call civilization and society, we become Darth Vader. We're part human, part machine.
Yeah, I like that.
And the thing is, well, what are we going to be? Are we going to be human or are we going to be machine? What's the danger of being a machine? The danger of being a machine is Nazi Germany. We just all march towards oblivion.
Deferred responsibility or diffuse this responsibility. You do your bit.
Yeah. Young lived and encountered the Nazis. In fact, he had a meeting with Goebbels, wasn't it?
Didn't know that.
After which he felt violently ill, by the way. He vomited.
Just from the presence of
Goebbels.
Yeah,
just from the presence of him. He was sickened by him. But he was famously quoted, he was at a conference in Germany, maybe in the 1930s, and the army was goose-stepping outside, and he said, oh, there they all go marching towards oblivion, because he could see it coming. And indeed, Jung had terrifically disturbed visions in his dreams about Europe being covered by a sea of blood.
Yeah, the deaths of tens of millions of people.
So that's the danger, I think. So what's the answer to that? Well, the answer to that is definitely not thou shalt and thou shalt not, because there's this guy in the sky who's going to get very mad at you if you don't.
Yeah.
Because that's, I think, has been part of our problem. The answer is probably somewhere between. Yes, you're right. We need to have a machine to serve our needs. But what are our needs? If our needs are purely material, then the machine will be a purely material thing. If our needs are organic, the machine will be an organic thing. If our needs are spiritual, the machine will be a spiritual thing. It needs to be like a chimera. Is that the word for it? It needs to be a sort of a mixture of things,
Yeah, symbiosis, maybe, or...
Yeah. Excuse me for not having the correct terminology to hand. But I tell you, I am one of those people who... regularly commutes up and down the motorways to a job in Dublin. And like a lot of other people, I sit sometimes in very heavy traffic, not moving very far, very fast, and all these thousands of vehicles, wondering, what the hell did I do
to deserve this?
Do you know?
Yeah, I've done it. I've been that soldier.
Yeah. And I'm sure many of your listeners are in the same position.
They could be listening to us right now on the M50.
So they're leading the ideal life. The ideal life is that husband and wife, say 2 or 3 kids, both working, both in professional jobs, this, that, and blah, blah, blah. Both have a car, nice 4-bed, semi-detached house, allegedly happy with their lives.
Yeah.
Leaving their house at 7 a.m. every morning and not getting home till 7:30 in the evening.
Yeah,
exhausted.
While someone else minds their kids.
Yeah. So... that's the machine for me, and that is the antithesis to my spiritual life, which is the quiet moments by the Boyne or up on the hill watching the sunset, or
it's the antithesis to not just your spiritual life, but to a spiritual life. Like how could you be?
Well, there are some practitioners who say that you can enter a state of calm, and you can have your heaven in any place if you really want to make it. I can't say yay or nay to that. All I can say is that in my own experience, I very much have to have the sacred space, as it were, which can be as simple as just being in a forest, or being in the Boyne Valley, or being at some sacred site or monument, or watching the stars somewhere at night, and just it's really, really simple, So, for instance, if you've ever seen the film Invictus, Nelson Mandela spent, what was it? Was it 26 years of his life?
The best part of 30
in
anyway.
In a tiny cell.
Yeah.
and Invictus summarizes his defiance, is his will to become a heroic, epic, mythical character who is unfortunately trapped in this little box. Out of the night that covers me, dark as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. And I just think that's so powerful.
That's Mandela.
That's Invictus, which I'm not sure who the poet was, but that was one of the things that he apparently read and spoke as a, it's one of the things that kept him sane.
And is there an analogy there, do you think, to modern life with all its commuting and all its bullshit to the cell?
We're in that box. Yeah, we're in it. Of course we are. Okay, it's comparable. It's not a physical copy, but in many respects, it's the same thing.
Yeah, it's analogous.
You're in a box, aren't you?
Well, the way I've been phrasing it is that you're on the lead.
On the lead, yeah.
On the lead of society. And again, getting back to the whole premise of our conversation here and the other conversations that I've had and the ones that I'm striving to have, it's all about getting people off the lead. It's just wakening people up, I suppose, that there is an alternative to X Factor and Coronation Street and, pints of Heineken at the weekend and whatever has been rammed down your throat in HD, in Ultra HD, fucking 4K.
And you need to have the newest TV. And of course, the advertisements pop up to tell you that you need this TV to watch because the one that you're watching on isn't good enough. And so therefore you need to earn more money and put more by and you need to work harder and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and don't forget the pension and the life insurance and all the rest of it. All very, very, very important.
Yeah. Of course, none of that was relevant in Stone Age society. But at the same time, look, I'm not suggesting for a second. I'm always saying to people, you can only live in the time that you're living in.
Well, I love this time period. I think this is the golden era of everything.
I do think that we're very fortunate. If only we could work towards the common good all of the time, we could achieve so many brilliant, brilliant things. But we're driven to conflict so much. It's like, guys, at the end of the day, we all, as President Kennedy said, we all share this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we're all mortal.
Yeah.
So, on that basis, why the hell don't we all just have a big group hug, and just agree that you're different to me, and you have different opinions to me and different outlooks, but that's okay. That's all right. So long as you don't threaten to kill me, or you don't, physically harm me, or deprive me of, for instance, my way of life, or my food, or my natural resources that I need to live, then we're okay. But for some reason we're driven to conflict,
Yeah, why can't we all just get along? Like it sounds a bit arty-farty and airy-fairy, but I mean, never was a truer word said, really. Like, why can't we just all get along?
And there's an impediment to it, which is a sort of a natural human thing, but unfortunately it's a lack of maturity on behalf of a lot of the leaders of today who are so obsessed with their own images and their own egos, they don't realise.
Well, I think the idea of having a career politician, I think, is inherently wrong. So once you become a career politician, your job is to get re-elected, and that never serves the people you're supposed to be serving at all.
Yeah. And we could be on the verge, let's be honest, we could be on the verge here of a very major catastrophe.
How so? Politically or socially or economically or all of the above?
I mean, there's the drumming up of a lot of hatred and division and xenophobia and blaming, looking outwards for the cause of the problems of an individual or a society.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there.
And the most urgent work, according to Young, of our age, is the looking inwards.
Yeah.
And it's not being facilitated.
I think people are looking for people to blame, but that comes from being inherently unhappy.
Which ties in with the argument, which would make another 4-hour interview about we are responsible collectively for the collapse of the Celtic Tiger economy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, as you said yourself so wisely, we won't go down that rabbit hole
too
deeply.
No. I don't want to become a hate figure, you know. I'm happy enough to do my Mythical Ireland thing and for people to be inspired by it, because, look, it inspires me, and I would like to think that what I've done will inspire people to a better future and to a better humanity.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Which is the dream. And I think, which is, by the way, the original purpose of myth, was to allow the initiate to be confronted with the mysteries and the intangibles of life, and to be able to deal with that and reconcile them with that. And part of that reconciliation is a reconciliation with yourself and your own base nature, your own cannibal, your own savage nature.
Yeah, your shadow is, I think.
Your shadow, exactly as Jung puts it. And what is that? Because that just sounds like loose terminology that I'm spouting out here and all sorts of new age wishy-washy claptrap. What I'm talking about is being able to look at your... And it's in a way, it's kind of looking at your... confessing your sins. Except for, I don't believe it's healthy for a human to look upon themselves as a sinner, because first and foremost, you see the faults.
Yes.
I think it's more healthy for a human to first and foremost consider your strengths and your good points. The problem is a lot of people don't want to admit that they have any failings. They don't want to confront that at all, and there's no meaningless confrontation of it and reconciliation of it. The idea is that you meet the devil and you shake hands with the devil, but you meet him on your terms, you know, that you're not afraid to go to that place. So in mythology, here's a very good example. In mythology, the source of the Boyne River in mythology is Nectan's well, which is a male domain. Nectan being the male king, and his 3 cupbearers who are all male. No one shall approach the well except for Nectan and his 3 cupbearers. Bowen, who is his wife, decides, I'm going to approach the well, and she walks around it 3 times anti-clockwise, which is widdershins, which is against the natural order of things. And of course Jung would tell you that is the movement towards the unconscious. So in defying the wishes of the king, what happens is the well basically bursts forth into a huge fountain and engulfs her and washes her down this channel, creating the Boyne River as it goes along. And it's washing her down and pushing her down, creating the river. And as it does, she becomes mutilated. And eventually it goes out to sea and washes her out to sea, where she's drowned. So there is the essence of a myth that is very much about the confrontation of your own shadow nature. Like the symbolism, as I said very early on in the interview, of the water, which represents the unconscious.
And the reflection yourself.
And the idea of looking into a well, you're going to see a reflection, and that reflection is faithful. In other words, when the mask is taken off and you realise what you are beneath that,
you lose your persona, say.
Your base nature.
Yes.
Like the things that you don't want the public to know about, you know? Like the fact that you can be a bit of a you know, I could use language, but you can be a bit of a prick, and, you know, maybe you've said and done things to hurt people. Maybe you have certain beliefs that don't sit well with, you know, maybe somebody out there is a bit of a racist but doesn't want to admit it.
Maybe you've wanted to do things but never did.
You know, now that's not to say that you normalise it. It's not about normalising what's not right in you, or normalising behaviour towards your fellow humans that is not conducive to harmonious relations. It's just about acknowledging that that's there, and it's there in all of us. And the problem is that an awful lot of people just haven't... Well, look, I don't think they have the structure, or I don't think they've been given the proper education, grounding, insight into that. And I think that's part of what a mythical and spiritual life would actually do for a person, is to enable them, first and foremost, to have the maturity to say, well, hang on a second, before I enter a discussion with this person in which I'm going to disagree vehemently with them and we're going to get into a row, is there something about what I'm going to say is actually a reflection of my own nature? And is there something that I could do with myself in terms of confronting that nature that might make me change my mind somewhat, so that I'm a little bit more mature about it, perhaps, you know?
You have a bit of introspection.
It's a good word, isn't it?
I love it.
Looking inwards.
Yes, absolutely.
Introspection.
Yeah.
Sincere looking inwards.
Yes.
Not superficial. a sincere looking inwards. And that's part of the journey that humanity needs to take urgently.
Oh, absolutely.
And Jung was saying that a century ago. Well, almost a century ago.
Yeah,
he was saying that before the catastrophes certainly before the Second World War, and the senselessness of that. Do
you think the world wars had to happen to a degree? Like, throughout, like, if put it this way, if we were to discover another planet with life akin to our own, do you think they'll have had their world war? Do you think that it was not essential but necessary, maybe?
That's part of the Drake equation, which is something that Carl Sagan wrote about in trying to figure out how many other alien civilizations there might be out there. One of the variables of the Drake equation. So the Drake equation is an equation designed to try and work out, what percentage of the planets out there might have life on them.
Yeah.
And one of the variables is about whether a civilization has reached the stage of self-destruction or not, or whether they've
the ability to
grow up and mature and get beyond that.
Yes.
And I think we're at that moment.
Well,
we've never possessed the tools before to completely destroy human life, and we have those now, man-made.
We have them decades. Like, I mean, when were they dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Yeah, but it's what 40s? I mean is, when I say we've never had that, we've existed as humans, we've existed for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, we have the ability.
We have them as of this morning, say, when you look at that kind of time.
Yeah, on a 12-hour clock, we got that ability about 30 seconds ago, maybe 10 seconds ago. So it's kind of a very frightening place to be. And the reason it's a frightening place to be is because the next one could be the last one.
Yeah, absolutely.
What was it? Was it Einstein said, if the Third World War is fought with nuclear weapons, the Fourth World War will be fought with sticks and stones?
Oh, I never heard that. I like that now.
Because nuclear war is the end.
Would be left,
it's a world-ending event, really.
Yeah.
I don't think not a life-ending event, but maybe a human life-ending event.
Well, that's another thing.
Something always thrives in adversity, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
The cockroach, isn't it? The cockroach, the famous animal that's going to survive. Did you ever see Narcos?
Yes.
About
Pablo Escobar.
Horrible individual, yes, that horrible human who's murdered so many people. But there's a guy in that called Cockroach, and they're all lined up to be shot, and he somehow survives.
Yes, of course.
And the analogy is that it's said that a cockroach will survive the nuclear holocaust. So who knows? In 1,000 years' time, after some sort of great human-led holocaust, cockroaches will rule the world.
It's funny. You hear people talk about this impending, global warming, and it's going to be the end of us all, and the sea is full of plastic, and we're poisoning the air, and all the rest of it. And look, we absolutely are, and that has to be addressed immediately. But this notion of that we have to save the planet, I think, is just a bit comical, really. The planet will be fine.
Yeah, we have to save ourselves.
Yes, it's us that we have
first
to look
and foremost.
After,
the most pressing task is the salvation of ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the problem you have with that is you'll have all sorts of scientists saying this is what we need to do, and you'll have, of course, all sorts of religious people saying this is what we have to do, and all sorts of spiritual and mystical people saying this is what you have to do. And I'm trying to earnestly suggest that a spiritual and mythical life is part of the solution. People are going, he is definitely mad in the head. He has completely lost it. Because, see, too many people, as I said, tie in religion and spirituality as the same thing. But they're not. As I said, they're very, very different. Science and spirituality need to come together to find a solution. We're very ingenious. We have the spark of genius in us. We have something in us as a species. Like, we went to the moon, like, even the fact that we discovered the atom, and then I suppose that eventually led to the discovery of the nuclear bomb. We're so ingenious, There's so much that we could do. In fact, I believe that there's nothing that we can't do. I really think. I think we have the ability to find solutions to all our problems. With the right will and with the right funding, we can find probably cures to all the major diseases, for instance, and that's evolving all the time. There's new discoveries and all the rest. But we just refuse to reconcile ourselves with our dark nature. And that spills over into anger. And then that anger spills over into sort of mass conflict.
No, absolutely. And I think when people get angry at other people, what they're angry at is the reflection of what they hate about themselves. And if you don't understand what you hate about yourself, you're never going to be able to appreciate why you hate somebody else so much. So I'm 100%. I couldn't agree with everything that you've said more, being perfectly honest.
What was it that the white man hated so much in the native savage, in quotes, in places like America, the Native Americans?
Their freedom, probably, was
or
it?
the African tribes. Yeah, that was part of it.
Yeah.
Their simplicity and their...
Yeah. How at peace they were with themselves and each other.
They weren't going to make war with the world.
No, they didn't have to.
They weren't fighting over someone else's mineral resources.
Yeah.
Okay, look, some tribes were quite brutal. In fairness, let's not paint a rosy picture. You know, you only have to look at the Comanches in the Native American Indians, for instance. They were quite brutal. I mean, they'd peel your scalp off with a knife and let you bleed out, you know, and then wear it on themselves as a trophy. But I think there is an aspect of that where we see in the savage a simple nature in ourselves that we somehow haven't reconciled with, and therefore we see it as something exterior, and we see it as something that's to be derided and something that's completely the antithesis of who we are as human beings. Because we're advanced, aren't we? And we're grown up, and we're scientific, and we're knowledgeable, aren't we?
We're not.
We're all that. Yeah. So therefore, with all of that now that we have, we can't possibly encounter any difficulties because we have the solution to everything.
Yeah.
Not knowing that actually we're, as I said, constantly on the threshold of either an ingenious breakthrough into a new phase of existence on the planet, or some sort of appalling apocalypse of our own making.
It's always one way or the other, isn't it?
Yeah, and of course that's kind of present in myth too, isn't it? Like there's like a
heaven and hell.
There's an ongoing sort of theme in world mythology of the battle against light, against darkness, and I think kind of that is, when you pare it down to its core, that is just about the inner human nature, the darkness and the light that are vying against each other.
Yeah, the yin and the yang. It's in every culture.
I suppose so, you know. Anyway, not to be too pessimistic, the point is that we have the resources and the ingenious nature to find solutions to all our difficulties.
Absolutely, and I would view
that's a fact, you know.
I would view this medium that we have now, just two guys never met before today. I just, for the benefit of the people listening, I was chatting to a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago, Neil Riley. I hope to have him on, and I was asking him, you know, what would he like to talk about, or what? I asked him to come on the podcast, and he said, well, what would I talk about? And I said, well, what have you an interest in? And he's like, I've an interest in loads of things. And I was like, well, name some. And he was like, oh, I don't know, mythology. And I was like, right, mythology. Come on and chat about mythology. And he got a bit excited about it, but then he was kind of wearisome of coming on and discussing it because he didn't really know as much about it. He didn't, you know, that kind of way. So he opted not to do it. I'm sorry, I've lost my own train of thought. But in relation to so I ended up Googling Irish mythology because he kind of put me onto it. He's like, oh, mythology, that's something that I don't really know a lot about. Googled it, found your name, and said, Jez, he'd be a great guest, and sent you a message over Facebook, and to a bit of back and forth, here we are. And that's fantastic that we live in a world that I could just find you, you know, that, send you a message, bit of back and forth, and lo and behold, within a wet week, here you are, and our conversation is going to be immortalised now when I put it online for the, you know, for however many people to listen to now,
7
in the future.
1,000.
But
million.
but it's gas, like, because just on the back of the handful of recordings that I've made, advertised, for want of a better word, on my own personal Facebook page, it's reached over 3,000 people in 28 odd countries, like, and the reach that has is just phenomenal. And you've what, 40 odd thousand people following you on Facebook. Like,
yeah.
That's enormous reach. That's reach the world has never
that's
seen
great.
before.
And so just to continue with the theme of the black and white and the good and the dark, or the light and the dark and the good and the bad, there's also a lot of people out there who are using the internet as propaganda for their own hatred.
Yes, no, absolutely.
So I suppose that's not to do with the technology.
Well, the
That's
technology
just
is
to
a
do
tool.
with the humans who are using it.
Yes.
It's not the technology that's to blame.
Yes.
It's just the technology enables some of these people to reach a wider audience than they might have reached if they were just printing pamphlets and handing them out, which is what you would have done a generation ago.
Of course.
Never before have we had so much knowledge at our fingertips, and yet never before has our attention span been so short.
Yeah, well, I think that's changing, and I think that the internet not that it hasn't caught on, it hasn't been around long enough. It hasn't evolved to what it's going to be. It's still fluxing. So I think we're at the stage now of heightened, give it to me in 140 characters. You know, look at this, it's a 3-minute video. 3 minutes? I don't have 3 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of way. But I think that's a moment in time. I don't think that's the future of the internet. I don't think the dust has settled on what the internet is by a long stretch.
Yeah, well, sure, it's constantly. Who'd have thought even 10 years ago that, you know, most of what you were going to digest in terms of information would be done on a small device that you carry around in your pocket that you also make phone calls on.
Yeah.
Like, in fairness.
Yeah.
And the whole selfie thing, you know. Selfies.
But again, I think that'll be looked back on. I think people will learn about selfies in history books.
But look, isn't that a prime example of what we've been talking about half the night? Is that the selfie reflects back at you what you want to see, whereas the mythical well or the mirror reflects back the true nature
opposite
of yourself
Yeah.
that you don't want to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe that's the selfie is a sort of a symbol of the non-mythical status of modern Western civilization.
But that was in our mythology. Like Narcissus is the only one that springs to mind because I'm not up to speed with Irish mythology or other mythologies. But that's the kind of, colloquially in Ireland at least, the Greek gods and myths are a bit more. Unfortunately, they're closer to hand than our own mythology, which is a shame in itself. But the fact that the likes of Narcissus, I was going to say existed, but the fact that stories of narcissistic people are there since at least the Greek times would show that that's been a problem throughout our history as a species. It's not a new thing.
The myth is there, I suppose, to try and teach and warn about these possible natures in people.
Absolutely.
You know,
that we learned, you know, from before the get-go, from when it was, you know, grunts and not really language. There was people realised that you couldn't, you know, fuck over people in your neighbourhood without it coming full circle and kind of coming back to bite you.
Yeah.
Where do you think, this is a big question, but where do you think it kind of went wrong historically? Like there's this idea that I've heard that when St. Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland, he drove the druids out of Ireland and the shamans and whoever else. Is there any credence to that from the work that you've done, or does that make sense? Like to me, it makes sense, but I'm not in a position to know whether it was remotely true or not.
Not really sure.
Because Christianity did, whether it intended to or otherwise, drive the pagan cultures and our own.
Well, it did
myths.
to an extent, but don't forget that in the early Christian church in Ireland, there was actually a meeting of ways. Like the two things, what existed previously and what came after, kind of merged. We had a very peculiar, specific form of Christianity, which is, you know, early Irish Celtic Christianity, which was kind of loosely based around the stuff that had happened, or the not necessarily the deities, but I think the fact that there was no bloodletting when Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland is an indication that rather than him defiantly suppressing everything, that there was a sort of a merger. What really emerged in Ireland in early Christian times was a folk religion that had 1 foot in Ireland and 1 foot in I suppose in Rome, but not really in Rome, because it more in the sort of Christian Europe, as it were. You know, we were very big on ritual, like patterns and, you know, repetitive saying of the rosary while counting beads, which are in effect stones, like the curbstones of Newgrange, you know. Somebody once said to me, Newgrange is like a giant set of rosary beads, you know. Do you make some sort of incantation as you go around it, stopping at each one, you know? And even with the crucifix, because there's a crucifix in Newgrange, which is its chamber. Like, the crucifix was a sacred symbol in Ireland 3,500 years before Patrick. Well, yes. 4,000 years or so before Patrick arrived.
Well, predating Christianity, never mind.
Yeah, and by a long, long way, you know. I don't know. I'm not an expert now, so I'm not very well read on early Christian Ireland. But from what I understand of it, anyway, there was no martyrdom and there was no major bloodletting.
Sorry, you mentioned bloodletting there a minute ago.
I mean, you know, there was no violence.
Okay.
You know, not that we're aware of. You know, Patrick arrived and Christianity was kind of embraced almost by the Irish people who existed at the time. And I think in part because it allowed this merger, this dovetailing, as it were, between what was there and the new system of beliefs. Look, a very good example of that is the fact that sort of St. Bridget, who became one of the sort of main Irish saints, along with Patrick and Columbus. Columbus. Not the man who claimed to have discovered America. You know, Bridget, before she was a saint, was a two-headed Danann goddess, daughter of the Dagda, chief god, who built Newgrange. There you go.
I wouldn't have known that.
Yeah, there you go. But simple stuff like, you know, the fact that, you know, St. Patrick's Day ended up closely tied with the spring equinox, and solstice and Christmas are effectively the same celebration, really, at the end of the day, you know. The
death and rebirth of the sun, and like the literal sun and the sun in the sky and the son of the Father.
So I don't think all that was an accident. I think Patrick may have been quite an astute politician as much as he was a religious figurehead, you know, if he existed.
Of course.
And there's another 4-hour discussion, and that's another. What was the phrase about can open, worms everywhere? You know, no, we're not doing that. We're not doing that tonight. But
what are the other can of worms that you've come across in your years of studying this, and like what have the things that what have you said in the past that's been controversial, or what are the things you're almost afraid to talk about? A couple of them have kind of popped up here tonight. There's no glaring ones that.
No, to be honest, I'm not really the one that kind of I've been wary about for a long time is the High Man, and the High Man is like a giant warrior figure. It's a pattern in the roads. This is
a county-sized thing, is it?
Yeah, it's huge. It's like 14 miles high or whatever. It happens to be a most extraordinary coincidence, or set of coincidences, that's really, really astonishingly interesting.
And can you lay that out for people? Because again, I've seen, I think, a drawing of it, probably on your social media
the basic
platforms.
Background to it is that this is a figure that Richard Moore found in the roads. He was looking at a map one day, and he saw this figure, and then he realised, well, you know, the knee is where Amergin is supposed to be buried, which is Millmount and Drogheda. Amergin was known as Amergin Bright Knee, you know. And he said, well, he looks extraordinarily human. And then the area in which it's based was anciently called Ferrard, which means high man. And then the area in which it's located is basically the area of most significance in Irish mythology and in terms of the megaliths, because it's got the most significant ones within its border. So basically have this giant warrior who could be Lugh, who gave his name to County Louth, or who could be Cuchulainn, who was a giant warrior who fought in Ford Water and he's standing in the Boyne River. Or he could be Nuadu because he's got his silver arm, you know, raised up into the Milky Way. Or he could be Amergin of the Bright Knee because he's buried at Millmount. Could be any number of sort of Irish, mythical, heroic, godlike, warrior-like characters, seemingly based upon the constellation of Orion, which has always been seen, almost exclusively seen in ancient cultures around the world as human, anthropomorphic, a hunter, a god, a warrior, whatever have you, you know, whatever you have in yourself, as they say. The reason for my reticence was because I kind of realised that maybe people kind of have the idea that I think the High Man was actually something that was designed in prehistoric times, which I don't believe. I don't even know if it's anything more than just an extraordinary set of coincidences. But the last chapter of my first book, Island of the Setting Sun, is devoted to the High Man, and it outlines all of these curious things about all the place names and all the myths attached to that area, and how it just all seems like one gigantic synchronicity. And I think I've kind of learned to sort of conclude that you kind of you have to take what you want from it. It just happens to be fascinating.
Yeah.
And do I believe it was intentionally put there? I don't think so. Obviously, people built roads, but they didn't design them in the shape of a warrior figure based on the constellation Orion, did they? Or did that just happen accidentally? But you know what?
Yeah.
Even in asking that question, it's actually fascinating. Because you want to dismiss out of hand the notion that it was designed intentionally. But then you're like, but the coincidences are extraordinary. So it just is what it is.
And have you found that controversial, speaking about it? Or?
Yeah, I have, yeah.
And what's the pushback against that?
That it's a bit ridiculous.
But I mean, is it not a bit ridiculous that you would build something like Newgrange or the pyramids back when they built it? They're ridiculous. That's preposterous, really. Like if there was no remains of Newgrange, and then you started talking about this huge big tomb and all these stones that would have had to have been brought from here, there, and everywhere, that'd be equally ridiculous, would it not?
It might be, yeah. I suppose it just depends on your perspective, you know. So I think that was one thing that I was reticent about talking about. Look, for a time I would have been uncomfortable talking about the mythology because I was learning all this as I was going along. You understand?
Of course.
Like when I started all this 20 years ago, I didn't have this knowledge of, especially of the mythology. I had the astronomical knowledge because I've been an amateur astronomer since I was in primary school, since I was about 8 years old. So I had a sufficient astronomical knowledge to help me through, and I had a reasonable knowledge of some of the archaeology, so I needed to brush up on that too. But nowadays, I'm kind of much more comfortable because one of the things that's been fundamental to my work, and I actually think you mentioned it earlier on, is I'm not here to say that I have answers to mysteries and I have answers to questions. And it's one of the things that a few of the experts have said to me that they like about my work is that you don't pretend that you have all the answers. You just ask very interesting and probing questions, which open all sorts of avenues of exploration. But you don't seem to reach definitive conclusions that quarrel with this evidence and dismiss other evidence, as some writers have the problem that they write a lot from ego. So the problem is that they're putting forward certain postulations and theories.
Their own agenda, say.
Yeah, but which go very much in the face of accepted evidence. And I'm careful not to do that, because I think if you're writing something that clearly contradicts all the evidence, then, well, what are you writing? You're writing fantasy. So then write a work of fiction, write a novel.
Yes.
You know, if you want to call it non-fiction, then you have to ground it in some facts. So one of the things, and I don't mind saying this to your listeners, one of the things that I really don't like is when I see a non-fiction book, a work of non-fiction, that on the outside looks, yeah, this is a good premise. It promises this, that, and the other insight, and to explore various mysteries and to try and give answers. And it looks promising. And then you're reading it and you realise there isn't any bibliography and there's no references in it.
Yeah.
So where are they getting it from?
No accountability.
No accountability. In my books, like particularly in Ireland is like a thesis, right? In the chapter 12, which is the chapter about the High Man, which might seem like a little bit of a far-fetched idea, right? There are 219 references. So,
but that's what you want in something far-fetched.
So, yes, you mightn't agree with some of what I say, but go and follow the sources yourself and have a look at where I'm coming from, at least.
Yeah.
But if you write a book that claims to be non-fiction and some books don't even have a bibliography.
Yeah.
Like, at least if you have a bibliography, it's a good start, but it's not enough, in my opinion, to list 20 books that you claim your book is based on. The reader, the intellectual reader, will want to follow some of the sources. They'll want that deeper. he says this here, but why does he say it? Where does he get that from? And you go, oh, he gets it from the Dindshenicus. Okay, I understand that now.
Yeah.
And they then can go and read that themselves if they so wish.
But I find it very reassuring to have references, because not that I'll do my due diligence, but I know that if I, let's say, Google your name, and if I say, you know, Anthony Murphy criticisms and put that into Google, if you've put in dodgy references or if there's no references, you'll throw up someone giving out about you.
Yeah,
do you know that kind of way? So,
but you lose integrity, you know.
Of course.
But there are enough, unfortunately, in the sphere of mythology and ancient history, there are an awful lot of fly-by-nighters. And I'm not putting down fellow authors. I have a lot of fellow authors in this field that I have enormous respect for, right? There are some people who, let's say, are a little bit careless with the references and the facts, etc., etc., but they've written very popular work. I'm not going to name any, by the way, just so don't ask me to. They've written very popular works, and they've managed to dupe a lot of people into believing that what they're saying is factual, but in essence, you're not able to follow the trail because there is no trail. And how can you have any standing as an author if you don't? You have to reference what you say, even if you're. So if somebody disagrees with the line of theory that I've developed on a particular monument or in relation to a particular myth, or if I've suggested that something might be cosmological in origin and they disagree with that, that's okay. They can disagree with me. What they can't say is that, well, you haven't quoted the reference.
You're just spoofing.
Yeah. And they can, word for word, when I've directly quoted stuff, or if I've paraphrased, they can go to that and say, oh, actually, he has quite faithfully represented that. So at least that's a merit badge in your defence, as it were.
Yeah.
Because when you put yourself out in public, one of the things that happens is you attract people who like what you write and like what you do, but you also attract detractors.
Of course.
Attracting detractors. There we go again. All of these words that we're coming up with tonight. So one of your listeners, we need to challenge the listeners to come up with a word that means the ology of everything. The combination of archaeology, anthropology, geology, cosmology, mythology, all of that stuff in one word ending in ology, please.
Yeah, no, that'd be nice.
Does that word exist already?
And then we can call you that with ist at the end of it, whatever it is ist.
Yeah. The thing is to remain faithfully true to yourself. It doesn't mean to follow your beliefs down a black hole, and it definitely don't. I had a guy who approached me one day and he said, I want you to have a look at something. I have a theory about Newgrange. So I was like, yeah, okay, fine. And as the OPW guides at Newgrange will tell you, everybody has a theory about Newgrange. Almost everybody has a theory. And this guy seemed like a very sound, rational guy. He said, I have it done as a sort of a draft paper. Would you have a read of it? I had a read of it. It was about an alignment. I'm not going to get into specifics. I don't want to identify him. But the long and short of it was that this is all in a time frame. I need to move the time frame of Newgrange to fit my theory. So although the archaeologists say it was built in 3150 BC, I need it to be built in 2600 BC.
Yes.
I'm sitting here going, so you're overturning all of the evidence for a theory. So your theory's nonsense, basically. But I didn't want to say that. Of course, I didn't say that because I'm not that. You know, I don't put down people just for the sake of putting them down, and I'm not really egotistical in that regard. The one thing I'm very careful about in my work is not, as I said, to pretend that I have all the answers or that I'm some sort of guru or something. Yet people like it, and yes, I have a following, and yes, I have quite a faithful following. Some of the people who follow me are nutcases.
Yeah.
Headbangers.
Well, if you've multiples of 10,000s of people, you know, following you, they're in there.
But you know what? In their everyday lives, they're probably quite decent people. And they're probably okay people to talk to and all that. And actually, I can think of a few people who are a bit off the wall, off the hand, but they're nice people to talk to. They just have some crazy ideas.
Yeah. Which is fine.
Who's right and who's wrong?
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, specifically in relation to the spirituality, which is one of the most controversial aspects of my work, because spirituality is controversial, full stop.
Oh yeah, it's a loaded term even, the word spirituality.
the idea of the afterlife, you know? And the only way we're going to find that out is when we're dead, you know? So I'm kind of hedging my bets. And as I keep saying, I'm much more comfortable now to say that I will die as an agnostic with a feeling that there is something.
Yeah.
Right? Based on evidence of afterlife experiences that people have had. I'm prepared to go with that and to hedge my bets on that than to die either as a complete atheist or as, say, a devout Christian, saying that Jesus is my only salvation. And I know that's heresy to some people. I know that might upset some people. Look, I don't say it to cause upset. That's the important thing. You always remember that it's. I remember once I learned a very interesting lesson. I gave a talk one day. It was only a small group, maybe 25 people, and I spoke a little bit denigratingly about the influence of the Catholic Church in Ireland. After which talk, I was praised by a lot of people, and then one particular individual took me aside and castigated me, saying that and this woman was completely right, how can you expect us to have respect for your work if your work depends on the denigration of somebody's beliefs in order to be accepted? And initially I kind of argued. I said, well, I'm not really denigrating, I'm just talking about facts and this, that and the other. And then I kind of went home with it and I realised, do you know what, she is actually true, that there are more polite and not light-hearted, but there are more
diplomatic, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good word. There are more diplomatic ways to say what you wanted to say without offending the Christian in the room. You know what I mean?
I'm finding myself getting much more diplomatic as I kind of age and become a little bit wiser, maybe.
Because as much as we say that religion has been at the core of a lot of conflict in the world, the hatred of one religion against another has also been a major problem for us as a species. So I learned a lesson from that, and the lesson was, look, who's to say I won't convert to Christianity like Cormac MacArt? You know, the first Christian king, because he converted just before he died. You know, who's to say I won't? I can't say right now I won't. I don't think it's likely, to be honest with you, being an agnostic and having been through all I've been through. I can't see it happening, but I shouldn't rule it out, and I certainly shouldn't denigrate those who do believe. Like, who's right?
Well, that's it.
Because maybe at the end of it all, they'll be proven right and I'll be proven wrong.
And you'll be at the pearly gates eating your words.
Yes, St. Peter will be handing me a large slice of humble pie and saying, eat this.
Anthony, I've taken up enough of your time. We're at the what? Just shy of the 2.5 hour mark.
Wow.
I'd have you back in an absolute heartbeat.
Seems like about 45 minutes we've been talking.
Yeah, no, it's great. And that's the nature of these stories. I mean, we haven't even touched on Irish mythology, really.
Yeah, I haven't really spoken to you about some of the...
We've skirted it. But
yeah,
this is exactly the type of conversation I was hoping to have with you.
Yeah.
Because it's an I suppose this episode is almost like an introduction for people to you and your work, and the importance of just our ancient history and the significance of mythology. And like, here's one that I'm going to throw at you, and I might be putting you a bit in the spot now, but you said there not so long ago that when you started out in your journey, you weren't keen to kind of talk to people about it because you were only kind of learning, you're only finding your feet. And an analogy to that is a white belt shouldn't be setting up a karate, club. Do you know that kind of way? So you wait until you progress to black belt level, and then maybe you start your club. What, looking back, like, so there's people who are listening to this, or maybe who, like myself, have kind of half started their journey down this rabbit hole, vague enough as it's been. What are the pitfalls to avoid, say? What like, if in hindsight, looking back, what do you wish you'd spent more time on, less time on? Is there, aside from your body of work, the books, the Facebook page, and everything else, and I'm going to ask you for kind of links and descriptions for all of them now in a minute, but is there documentaries that are to be found on YouTube? Are there, storybooks?
Yeah.
But what's the good stuff, though? Because it's kind of hard to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Yeah, well, first of all, there's a few aspects to what you just said. Was in terms of if people are starting out on their journey, as it were, and they want to know what to avoid and what to look for, I think one of the greatest things a person can do in their journey is just to make sure that, first of all, they seek in themselves what it is that follow your bliss, as Joseph Campbell would have said. Seek within yourself what it is that actually makes you truly happy, right? Don't denigrate other people, and definitely don't focus on the negatives, and don't focus on what's wrong, because that's I think a big part of the difficulty that we keep going on about tonight, about the journey that I think collectively, but also individually, that we have to undertake as a society, is, if it's taking you into difficult territory in terms of denigration of other people or other people's beliefs or whatever, then I would say just steer away from it for the time being. What you're basically looking for, essentially, on your journey is the light. You're looking for that light in the darkness, that Newgrange solstice moment, when in the cold and dark interior of the She, you're seeing a brilliant golden warm light emerge in through the darkness. As I call it in one of my works of fiction, like a sword of brilliance piercing the darkness,
Light at the end of the tunnel, Save.
Well, sort of, yeah. It's to focus earnestly on yourself, and it's just very difficult. That's because that's such a sort of very non-specific thing to say, and it's very difficult. As you say, it's like a white belt telling someone how they become a black belt. It's like, mightn't necessarily be in a position to dispense psychotherapeutic advice for people. But just from my own experience, is you have to ask why you're doing it in the first place. You're doing it because you love it, you're doing it because you're enjoying it, or you're doing it because you think you'll grow from it. Great. But if you find yourself in conflict with people when you're doing it, then maybe it's not just the right way of going about it, or you're not necessarily on the right path,
That's a warning, say, if what you're learning or consuming is distancing yourself from people, or maybe putting you at odds with other people.
Yeah. Or putting you into conflict with people specifically. You may want to put distance between yourself and other people. If you're engaging in a shamanic journey, as it were,
Yeah.
like the shaman who distances themselves from their community while they basically talk to themselves.
Yeah.
Because you're having
absolutely.
a conversation with yourself, as it were.
But I think we're missing that in our modern society, and I think this is a recurrent theme across nearly all the podcasts that I've done so far. This idea that we don't talk to ourselves anymore, because as soon as you leave the room to go to the toilet, I'm on my phone and I'm Googling whatever it is that we were talking about. Or if you're in a waiting room, or if you're on a walk, or if you're on a drive, you're listening to a podcast, you're listening to the radio, you're on all the time. We don't have the time for introspection anymore.
Yeah. And I don't meditate or practice yoga, and maybe that's something some people will want to do. But my form of meditation is, as I said earlier several times, is to be at peace in that moment, whether it be watching a sunset, or being by the riverside, or being at a monument and finding myself alone and just having contemplative and introspective moments. Didn't realise I was here to dispense spiritual advice, which is really interesting. My latest book actually has been categorised on Amazon as Celtic spirituality, and if people ask me what category would I put it into, I actually mightn't have known, but it was just automatically found its way into that category. And yet I started off really writing about the astronomy first and foremost, and now the mythology has drifted towards spirituality in essence. But I think I've laid that out throughout the whole interview, what I meant by spirituality. It's not this mystical voodoo stuff, It's more just to do about the journey of self-discovery. The other aspect of your question was, if people are interested, where do they start? It's a very good one. but you just please avoid the conspiracy theory stuff. There's enough flat earthers and alien stuff going on. Notwithstanding the fact that I have a documentary online about the High Man, which is my most popular video, actually. And I left it there because I just figured, look, it's an interesting subject. It is fascinating. But I think I take it too seriously. And that documentary was made maybe 10 or 12 years ago, But if people are interested in... It depends. Okay, so obviously you're going to probably... I have to recommend my own work. So I have 3 sort of major works of non-fiction: Island of the Setting Sun, Newgrange Monument to Immortality, and Mythical Ireland, New Light on the Ancient Past. They're all published by the Liffey Press. Island of the Setting Sun is out of print. You'll get a second-hand second edition copy for about $160. You'll get a second-hand first edition for about $2,000, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yeah, they're quite valuable. The others are still available, and Newgrange I think is $24.99 and Mythical Ireland is $29.99. If you're interested in the astronomy, and particularly the ancient astronomy, the works of Martin Brennan are very interesting, particularly the Stones of Time. And Brennan was an artist, and he drew all of the carvings and then tried to interpret them cosmologically and astronomically. Fascinating work. If you're interested in mythology, actually a very good place to start, which is kind of real easy, sort of slip you into it easily, is the Oxford Dictionary of Celtic Mythology, which is edited by James McKillop and is widely available. And an awful lot of Celtic mythology is Irish. There's some Welsh and some sort of Brittonic stuff in it and some European stuff, but it's by and large there's an awful lot of Irish stuff. There are an awful lot of reprints of older books about Irish mythology, the likes of Charles Squire, can't think of his name.
If the names come
too
to
late,
text them on, I'll
people
put them in the notes.
Might be interested in reading Thomas Kinsella's translation of the Taun, for instance. There are lots of little collections of Irish myth written by various people. There's Lady Gregory's translations of Cuchulainn and, what's it called? Gods and... I can't even remember the title of it yet because my head's fried at this stage. Lady Gregory's stuff. Online, there's a lot of... Yeah, you have to be careful. There's an awful lot of people who have the appearance of sane intellectualism and gravitas, but who maybe... The problem with, say, YouTube is that you don't have the references and the sources. So you're just watching somebody or listening to somebody and you're assuming that they're an expert, but you're not necessarily following the trail, that sort of way.
Of course, yeah.
I've done lots of YouTube videos, actually, as it happens. So my own channel is Mythical Ireland. I've done lots of videos about various aspects of the mythology and the astronomy that people can follow. So
yeah, so that, just to be clear for people, that's Mythical Ireland YouTube channel. So go into YouTube, search Mythical Ireland, you'll find yourself, subscribe and like and comment.
Just go to youtube.com/Mythical Ireland.
Perfect, and that'll bring you straight to the page.
Yeah.
I meant to mention it earlier, but the conversation kind of went another direction. Are you familiar with Graham Hancock?
Yes.
What's your views on Graham Hancock? Because he kind of skirts that line of expert spoofer, for want of a better term.
He's very interesting. And I think he has opened up lots of interesting avenues of research. And his work is very well written and very well researched and very well referenced, by the way.
Okay. That's encouraging to hear, because I haven't gone down that
I have
rabbit hole
enjoyed
deep
him.
enough.
The first of his books that I encountered was Heaven's Mirror, Search for a Lost Civilization. And I liked the premise of the book, and I really liked the imagery, and I liked the way he put it together. However, the theory itself is quite controversial. So, yeah, look, take it with a pinch of salt, but don't avoid. He's not one of those people I would avoid. Definitely not. He's fascinating. Fingerprints of the Gods is a magnificent work. You mightn't agree. Look, you can read somebody and not agree with their postulations and the avenues that they go down.
I think that's quite important that you do that, isn't it?
So it's to have the capacity to read somebody, but also not to be either a devout fan or a severe critic, to just be able to stand back and go, okay, yeah, that makes a certain amount of sense, and then in another page or chapter say, don't really go along with that,
Yeah, of course.
There's a very good book by two authors called Uriel's Machine, Robert Lomas and Christopher Knight, and it's very interesting. I don't agree with their ultimate premise that there was a one-size-fits-all machine that you could use to determine astronomical phenomena and azimuths and all the rest. But however, it's a fascinating work.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, you know? Like, you know yourself, like even Jung, who has a huge following, also has a huge number of people out there who denigrate his work and think he was a mystic and a bit of a spoofer and all the rest. So it's just to have the capacity. I wouldn't avoid people just because not everything they say is in agreement with the evidence, or not every. Well, it's not in agreement with the evidence. Maybe not in agreement with your own viewpoints. You know.
I think personally, I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have these days, is that we don't look into people who we disagree with, say, and we don't search for where, where they're coming from.
The way I look at it is, you'll see authors, and again, I'm not naming names, but you'll see authors and books, and you read and you read and you read and you go, hang on a second, well, that's not true, and what's that based on? And there's no references, and you see untruth stacked up against, a dodgy theory and dodgy speculation, and then you realise after a while, no, this isn't for me. However, if you see an author like Hancock, is very lucid, as I say, very well researched, very well written, very well referenced, who happens to make a few leaps of faith and puts forward a few theories that maybe are a little bit beyond, a bit of a stretch of the imagination. To me, that doesn't make a nonsense of his work.
Yes, it just shows that he has a
thinking
basically,
man.
And a thinking man. Yeah.
Yeah. He's fascinating. To me, he's opened up, and he's created quite a lot of controversy, and I think he sold a lot of books on the back of that controversy. Don't know if he necessarily starts out to be controversial. There are some people who are just like that,
Yeah.
But then, for instance, you have the likes of Eric von Daniken, whose work was very popular and popularised the idea of, alien civilizations using ancient sites as navigational beacons, and using the Nazca lines in Peru as landing pads and all the rest. Like, that's a stretch of the imagination for me, I'm sorry to say, But there's a man who sold millions of books, It's like, whatever you're into. As I say, one man's poison is another man's elixir,
Yes, of course, yeah.
So, just don't read everything. I think that's the way you should approach everything, even if you're reading a scientific paper. I read this tome by Witzel. I can't remember what is. He's got initials, but he's an expert in world mythology. He's written dozens and dozens of books and papers in his career, and seems to be an expert. I read good parts of this big chunky doorstep of a book, and I was fascinated by it. And then I went online and I read the reviews of his book on Amazon, and I discovered that something that was very true. He breaks world mythologies into two separate groups.
Okay.
And basically, is a little bit of a racist undertone to it.
Right.
That there were certain sort of darker-skinned savage tribes who, in his vision, had sort of less developed concepts, and their mythology was of a less complex nature, etc., etc. And a lot of people were accusing him of basically creating a sort of a racist theory of mythology. So it just gave me an insight on it, because I hadn't thought about that when I was reading through it. I was just so fascinated by some of the things which are refer to aspects of Irish mythology that I've written about in my books. I didn't stop to think about that aspect of it. Some people think that he's created a racist division, as it were, that actually isn't there, which is one criticism. So I suppose you always have to be careful. But if you're earnestly interested in a subject, you won't just read one book about it, will you?
Of course, yeah.
And you won't just read one person's.
Yes.
Like, I wonder how many students of Jung have actually read Freud's work.
Yeah, because Jung was,
and vice versa, by the way, because
yes.
Freud has such a huge following, much more so than Jung. How many Freud followers have read Jung's work? Because I've seen online debates about it in which Freudians absolutely poo-poo Jung, but I wonder how many of them have actually read his work. Or are they just basing that on something they read by somebody who had read Jung's work?
Well, I think Graham Hancock's one thing that he often mentions is a lot of he's caught out a lot of his detractors who've criticised his work. He's found them out basically as not having read his work.
So if you're going to criticise something, you have to be, at the very least, willing to read it to start with. You know,
oh no, absolutely.
Let's be honest.
Yeah.
So read it with an open mind. And I'm the same. There's very few books that I've bought that I've made the intention to buy, that I've bought and kind of become really disheartened by and disappointed by and kind of put them down and maybe gave away to St. Vincent de Paul or sold on or whatever. Mostly what I read, there's nuggets in them.
That's a reflection of you more so than the list of books that you could put up.
Maybe. There's some nuggets in Hancock, for instance. You know, Hancock is, I think, is largely... Look, he's interesting. So, yeah, somebody can be interesting and yet talk shite, you know?
Yeah, well, look...
I'm not saying he is. I'm just saying he's interesting doesn't necessarily put him on a pedestal. There was a time when I thought he was a bit of a genius, but we all have our flaws, you know, and we're all subject to these little flaws of our human nature. And Hancock ain't flawless, just put it that way. But his work is fascinatingly interesting.
Yeah, no, I'd be inclined to agree.
And opens up an awful lot of avenues that maybe weren't opened up by the mainstream academia. And that's not to say they're wrong, you know. There's enough people in the world putting down academia without us starting, you know.
No, absolutely. So the books, I'll put up a list of the books. Can you name the books out there again? Island of the Setting Sun.
Island of the Setting Sun, In Search of Ireland's Ancient Astronomers.
Your most recent one then, the next one then
The next one, Newgrange Monument to Immortality.
Your latest creation then?
Mythical Ireland, New Light on the Ancient Past.
The YouTube channel is?
youtube.com/Mythical Ireland. And same for Facebook, facebook.com/Mythical Ireland.
Are you on Instagram, Twitter?
Yep, same thing. Instagram.com/Mythical Ireland. Twitter, same thing again, yeah.
Are you on Patreon?
Yes.
Brilliant. Do you know the URL, or if we just search Patreon Mythical Ireland, you'll come up? I'm
not entirely sure whether I have patreon.com/Mythical Ireland. I think I have, but if you go on to patreon.com, you can search for Mythical Ireland and you'll get me.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so we all need support for what we're doing, you know.
No, absolutely, and I, for one, am absolutely going to support you, as I've started only recently to support all the other guys like yourself who fill me full of
And you know what, the great thing about Patreon is if you haven't got a lot of money, you can pledge $1 a month.
Yeah, well, that's
which
my
is not a lot of money.
That's my go-to.
But if I get sufficient $1 a month patrons, over time, there'd be no limit to what I can do, you know,
and
in terms of the work that I've been doing.
For people listening, to give them some sort of an idea of where you're coming from there, everything that you've done to date, the books, the YouTube channel, the blogs, the you know, reporting outside Newgrange, all the TV appearances, everything, even this, coming to meet me, having this conversation, everything that you've been done has been on top of presumably, you know, a
day job.
Odd, day job cost.
Mythical Ireland is what I describe as a glorified hobby.
Yeah.
That I hope to turn into a vocation.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Very soon, if I can make it happen. But I've been doing it for, well, the best part of 20 years. So, you know, I'm hoping to make that breakthrough sometime soon. But it is a passion and a hobby and something I do in my spare time. And I've largely done on a non-commercial basis. Yeah, well, listen, I think you could be at a kind of a critical mass point now, hopefully. And you could just be on the cusp of basically breaking it, because all it would take is some poxy celebrity somewhere to pick up with a bit of your work. I'm hoping imoffthelead will make me, you know.
Well, listen, the whole, and it's a semi-slogan of the imoffthelead mentality is that if you're only listening, you're not getting the point.
Yeah.
If you're only listening, you're not getting it. You have to enact this imoffthelead mentality, and if all you do is recommend it and Anthony's work to other people, start the conversation, provoke the conversations, have the conversations with people, and like what you alluded to earlier, that we all played our part in bringing down the economy, we all in turn will play our part in bringing Ireland and the rest of the world, you know, to a better place than where we are now.
Correct, yeah, 100%. So
listen, it's an absolute pleasure chatting to you. We just shy of the 3 hour mark, and I'd love to get you on again. I won't hold you to make an appearance again, problem. But absolutely love to get you back on again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.